Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching first part of What If Naruto Was the Strongest Swordsman in the DXD universe. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Let us share a boy's story with you, a boy who was cursed from a young age by a wicked god who harbored a deep hatred for the boy's ancestors. The curse itself was anything but typical. It was not one of those straightforward curses that result in bad luck, sickness, or instant death. Rather, it was more severe. It was an evil curse that robbed the boy of his life, health, and luck, but rather of his purpose. The boy was cursed, depriving him of the greatness his ancestors had planned for him. Instead of the success, prestige, and glory, he was left with a sense of endless emptiness that persisted throughout his life. As a result, the boy was shattered and distorted from an early age, lacking a sense of direction and significance in life. He was unfit for society, a boy unfit for even his own family, a distorted person who missed a few gears, and what many saw as damaged goods. They did, however, make a concerted effort to address the boy's issue. Mind you, they visited hospitals all over the world and spoke with medical professionals from a variety of specialties, but nothing could explain the boy's condition. As a result, his family and clan pushed him away and sent him to a place they believed they could fix if medicine was unable to heal the boy. Their only option was to have faith perform a miracle. The young, distorted boy spent the majority of his early years with a family friend who knew the church, thanks to the families sending him there. The boy spent days and nights living merely to live. The boy spent days learning just for the sake of learning. The youngster fought for days on end just to fight. The boy's life was hollow and empty for years until the day the boy met her. That girl is so gorgeous. Despite his lack of direction, the boy was still of the male persuasion because women always brought out the best in men, for better or worse. She altered him. As a result, the boy and girl met. At first, the boy did not get along with the girl because, in contrast to him, she had a higher purpose in life. She was meant to be great and accomplish good things. At the same time, he was just a boy, a brilliant but imperfect boy who had an idealistic perspective on the world. Nevertheless, the flawed boy was able to make friends with the girl in spite of their glaring differences, a friendship that lasted for days on end and produced one of the most exquisite sights the boy had ever seen. He saw a smile, a calm, contented smile that was warm, joyful, and compassionate, a simple smile that brought him an unheard of level of satisfaction and contentment that was entirely foreign to him at that time in his life. That warm, loving smile temporarily filled the huge emptiness inside the boy's chest with a comforting sensation. That was the point in time when the aimless boy was able to discover his life's purpose. Despite his immaturity and childishness, the boy dedicated his life to the belief that his purpose was to make people happy and smile. As a result, he turned into a cunning youngster who tried his hardest to make everyone around him happy, even at the expense of his own pride and reputation. He tried his hardest to make people smile. Why, after all, should he give a damn about what people think? He felt somewhat content as long as they were content. However, as the boy gained knowledge of happiness, he also learned about sorrow, suffering, loss, despair, and hopelessness. The natural enemy of the church, beings that were believed to be non-existent, were the primary cause of these feelings that frequently tormented his friends, devils and monsters. The boy's thoughts of happiness and sadness persisted, so he redoubled his efforts to spread joy and happiness among his church family, friends, and allies, to sacrifice his own life in order to make others, especially those close to him, happy and joyful. The boy's unhealthy and stupid obsession quickly turned into his dream, ideal, purpose, salvation, and, unbeknownst to him, his damnation. But in spite of his efforts, the boy eventually discovered that not everyone could be content. As he grew up in the church, yes, he realized that everything in this world had a price. As he grew older, one must lose for another to win, one must die for another to live, one must drown in sadness for another to find happiness. He was taught as a child that taking another person's life was a serious sin, so at first he wasn't sure how to fulfill his evolving oath. To his young and immature mind, that simple idea meant that in order for his friends to continue living happy and healthy lives, others had to die. But with the help of a few people in his life, he was gradually led down the warrior's path, much like a girl he had known in the past. Therefore, the boy chose to become a sword instead of dedicating his life to making everyone happy. A sword that brings joy and slashes down unhappiness. He pulled out a sword and used it to protect his allies. He must constantly bring misfortune and grief into the lives of demons, devils, heretics, and monsters who only bring misery and suffering in order to preserve the happiness of those around him. He could kill with the church's blessing without having to commit the serious sins that he was certain would make his friends hate him. Instead, he knew that they would be happy when they learned of his calling, and they were, which made him smile. For the benefit of his friend and allies, the boy was prepared to fight. For the benefit of his friend and allies, the boy was prepared to die. For the benefit of his friends and allies, the boy was willing to die. He followed the path of a bloodied sword without realizing it. He made that decision in order to maintain the happiness of those around him. Sure, as long as they were content, then he was also content. Such is a fool's self-destructive path I have chased after and defeated my adversaries. I didn't turn around until they were gone. I broke them, making it impossible for them to rise. They dropped beneath my feet because you have given me the strength to fight. You have put down those who opposed me. You have also given me my enemies' necks, that I might ruin those who despise me. They cried, but no one could save them, not even the Lord, who did not respond. I then threw them out like the dirt in the streets, beating them as little as dust before the wind. Psalm chapter 18 verses 37 to 42. Chapter 1. Your belief play the violent fluctuation Ost 14 for the Naruto Shippuden movie. Under the clear night sky, a battle, not a slaughter, was raging, and the moon was shining ever so dimly. Several corpses lay scattered, sliced, smashed, battered, frozen, and destroyed in the center of a cemetery. They were the only remaining members of a proud vampire named Teps's devoted vassals. Despite the lack of wind, the vampiric noble's ashen silver hair was flapping wildly as he fought for his life against one of his kind's most innate foes. No, the creature encountered the most basic of all his enemies rather than the likes of the ancient lichens. People being weak by nature, his adversary was expected to cower at his wake and beg for forgiveness, to which he was expected to respond by murdering him with the utmost condescension and ruthless brutality. However, that was untrue, for his adversary was much more than he had anticipated. His two adversaries, dressed in white priestly vestments, suddenly showed up and violently prevented him from engaging in his nightly activities of hunting down virgins, raping them until they were nothing more than dry husks, and sucking out their blood. Less than a minute after they appeared, his court of hundreds of small vampires and ghouls was reduced to just him, and based on the way the battle was going, he was certain that he would follow in his allies' footsteps. He, a proud vampire from Tep's illustrious family, lost to two ordinary mortals. His internal conflagration of anger and hatred was stoked by the mere thought. The vampire roared in unending rage as he charged at one of the two creatures that dared to degrade him. A bespectacled teenage exorcist with spiky blonde hair and cerulean blue eyes. Cold unnatural blue eyes. His claws were sharpening, his canines were lengthening, and his demonic wings were flapping around, all while his entire body was covered in a black, malicious aura. The vampire's target moved away from his furious charge with ease, much like a matador does with a bull. 3 sabers of pure light appeared between each teen's knuckles, totaling 6 blades of light on each hand, as their movements were nearly impossible to detect even with the most acute mortal eyes, and their footsteps were hardly audible. With a wave of his wings, the vampire rose higher and higher into the night sky until he was well out of the exorcist's grasp. The proud vampire yelled, "You detestable human! Know your place," as he shot himself in the direction of the exorcist with a sudden dive bomb. As his eyes closely monitored the vampire's path in search of the ideal moment to strike back, the bespectacled exorcist muttered, "I know my place." Boom! The exorcist narrowly avoided being smashed through by the rushing vampire as a sonic boom went by, almost blowing him away. Boom! The teenager barely managed to avoid a swipe from the vampire as another gust of wind whipped against the exorcist's body, while the noble from the immortal house of Teps persisted in his infuriating attack. 3 tiny gashes that resembled claws appeared on the teen's vestments, causing blood to flow. Slash! With his enhanced abilities, the vampire struck again, this time wounding the fleeing exorcist's shoulder with his long claws. Smash! The teen stumbled forward as the exorcist's stomach was struck by the vampire's ferocious wings. Smash! The bespectacled teenager was thrown high into the air by a punch to the jaw, which allowed the Teps to launch a barrage of blows that the exorcist could hardly dodge or block with his holy swords, the majority of which broke under the force of the vampire's attack. Crash! The vampire sent the blue-eyed blonde flying to the ground with a high-arching axe kick, leaving a tiny crater beneath the blow's weight. The airborne vampire, surrounded by more dark miasma, boasted, "Ha ha ha ha, having trouble keeping up, human?" The wounded exorcist rose slowly from the crater, not bothering to answer. He had cuts and gashes all over his body, and they were still bleeding, and the bruises were getting darker by the second. The bespectacled exorcist, however, appeared hardly fazed by the attack. Indeed, the teenager acted rather indifferently despite his severe injuries, which would have undoubtedly killed a normal man. It seemed as though the exorcist didn't give a damn about the harm his body had sustained. That was pretty close to the truth, really. The vampire clicked his tongue in exasperation as his wounded opponent displayed no signs of panic or even fear. TCH. Before flying down towards the exorcist spinning downward, the creature of the night said, "I bore of you in your existence. I guarantee that with this next blow you shall die, that is your future, you whelp." He created the impression of a dark crushing drill that would mowing down everything that was unlucky enough to be caught by the attack. The crystal blue eyes of the bespectacled exorcist were closed. Since his early years, the exorcist's eyes have been regarded as being better than those of the average person. In addition to being able to detect even the smallest details, his eyes allowed him to detect and follow rapidly moving objects. He could even see the world's life energy flowing through his eyes, which gave him a greater advantage in locating his adversaries and avoiding potentially fatal attacks from adversaries whose speed greatly outpaces his own. Many praised him for his eyes, which he seemed to have inherited from his ancestor, but he didn't seem to mind. He saw these eyes as merely a necessary tool for his mission to eradicate heathens. The blonde exorcist was able to observe the vampire's speed, power, attack patterns, and endurance because of his strong blue eyes, which have witnessed everything from the smallest to the most ostentatious movements. The teenager whispered, "I can see a different future, as a new set of swords, 4 in each hand, for a total of 8, replaced the blades that the vampire from the Tepes family had broken." The exorcist knew he had precisely 5 seconds before the vampire would arrive and most likely kill him with the impending attack without even having to look in his mind. He could see that he had only a 5% chance of winning and defeating his opponent, who was obviously better than he was. However, the exorcist knew that he could still win as long as that 1% remained. The teenager began counting down to the inevitable while keeping his eyes closed. 5. In order to prepare for his next move, he relaxed and breathed steadily and shallowly. 4. His senses stretched, considering the stillness of the ground, the sound of the wind, and the sound of his impending death. 3. His hands tightened around his blades, and his mind went into overdrive as he repeatedly rehearsed his plan in an attempt to find any potential weaknesses and, if feasible, fix them. 2. As the exorcist directed the majority of his body's energy, known as chakra, toward his limbs, his knees bent downward as he prepared for the jump of his life. The ground began to crack slowly beneath his feet. With all the factors taken into account, his plan was infallible. As the countdown continued to dwindle inversely with the now ferocious and deafening sound of the vampire's impending attack, he whispered, "Your future is 1." The exorcist's legs exploded with power, sending him as high as he could into the sky. He muttered, "Death," as he considered the future that lay ahead for both him and the vampire. If he failed, he would die, and if he succeeded, his opponent would also perish. From this point on, every move had to be accurate and within his calculations. A mistake would result in a terrible death. It was now or never. Errors were not allowed. He only had one chance. Nothing. He felt the wind crashing against his body, demonstrating how high he had leapt, and when he snapped his head down, he saw that the silver-haired vampire, a spiraling mass of darkness, was just a few dozen feet below him. The teen's eyes opened as if he had pulled the trigger of a metaphorical gun, revealing his cold blue eyes to the world. The man from the house of Tepes was currently grinding the ground where the exorcist had been just moments before. The bespectacled exorcist's preferred location for the heathens. The exorcist's arms flashed in a matter of seconds at a speed that was well beyond human capabilities. He initially hurled all 8 of the holy swords in the vampire's direction. Then another 8 came out of his sleeves and was thrown. 8 more, then another, and still another. The vampire was being slashed by at least 100 holy swords in a matter of seconds. Hyaku shi no aim, reign of 100 deaths, was the exorcist's next words, and they proved to be even more decisive in the vampire's defeat. Before being ignited and consumed by a brilliant wreath of azure blue flames that flickered ever so fiercely against the evening wind, the 100 holy swords that were showering the vampire all glowed a menacing blue when a simple phrase was uttered. Whoosh! As the swords allowed gravity to ensnare them and bring them down to the earth where their target awaited. The sound of multiple swords slicing through the air reverberated slowly. The attack was best described as a rain of sharp, fiery blue death, a demonstration of the exorcist's skill and a literal rain of flaming swords, blessed by the power of light, and created specifically to kill the damned. The spinning vampire, who was the incoming fiery rain of death as the sign of his demise, was certain that the image of 100 burning blades would be permanently etched in the mind of the person who was struck, despite the fact that it was a stunning visual appeal to everyone who would witness the beauty of this attack. Boom! The flaming blades of light exploded upon the rough earth, creating a maelstrom of destruction and fire, and a great cloud of smoke encircled the ground. When the 100th blade or so fell from the ground, the reign of death came to an end, and silence descended upon the area. Shortly after the attack ended, the dust cleared, exposing the vampire's multiple wounded forms to the descending exorcist. Both of his wings and the entirety of his left hand were gone, and his entrails were protruding from a large gash in his stomach. A sword was also protruding from his body, and the frame of his chest, legs, and feet were marred by multiple burning holes. There was blood all over. He was a proud vampire of the House of Teps, whose weakest members were regarded as equal to high-class devils, and that attack would have killed any lesser demons, no doubt, but he was not the same. He couldn't fall here, or at least not in a dignified manner. Despite being struck by at least 100 flaming holy swords, the wounded vampire stood ever vigilant and let out an unearthly roar that rocked the entire cemetery. "You are a bastard." As his wounds failed to heal because of the holy presence in the swords that continued to poison his system, the vampire yelled, "I'm going to die. Probably, but I'm not going to die alone." That human was going with him. As soon as the blue-eyed exorcist hit the ground, 2 holy swords materialized in his hands, preparing him for the next phase of combat. In his mind, his first attack was a spectacular success. The odds of winning increased from 5% to an astounding 85% now. All he needed to do was kill and incapacitate his opponent before he could get away. Even though the vampire was hurt, his speed was faster than that of an experienced exorcist. However, he was able to easily avoid the thrust of the silver-haired vampire's hand spear because he had adapted to the speed of the vampire's attack. However, the tombstone and the next 20 or so behind the blonde were unlucky because they were destroyed by the attack's penetrating wind pressure as well as the initial thrusting attack. In the exorcist's mind, the 85% chance of winning quickly dropped to 50% because he didn't think the vampire would still have that much strength after being impaled by multiple holy swords, which should have sapped his strength initially. He intended to turn it into a battle of attrition and simply avoid his opponent until he was gone. But those plans were quickly abandoned because there was only one clear winner: whoever lands their attack first wins. The injured vampire resumed his raging attack with renewed energy brought on by his impending death. Clang! With one quick motion, the vampire pulled his claw back and threw a devastating kick that the bespectacled exorcist barely managed to block by crossing his 2 swords of light across his chest. The vampire's remaining hands, diamond-hard, elongated nails turned into vicious claws that clashed against the divine blades within the exorcist's hands. Smash! With a flick of his wrists, a set of 4 holy swords materialized in his hands, and the exorcist, with his blue eyes never leaving his target, threw all of the blades towards the vampire, shattering the 2 blades as he was flung through the air with the crazed vampire pursuing him. Stab! 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 A plethora of holy swords skewered the charging vampire, causing a number of gut-wrenching sounds of muscle being torn apart and scraped. The vampire was essentially already dead, as all 8 of the holy swords crashed against his body, 4 of them embedding in his heart and the other 4 scattered along his abdomen. This would normally have resulted in the vampire's death right away, but this time, the vampire ignored his injuries and raised his hand before slashing it downward in a vicious and devastating chop that slashed the blonde diagonally in the chest. The blonde drew out his holy swords and intertwined them to block the blow, but they broke easily. His skin and muscle were torn, causing a squirt of red ichor to spray beneath the night sky. The creature of the night then twisted his body and delivered a crippling roundhouse kick that sent the exorcist rolling to the ground. Smash! With his wings already useless, the ashen-haired vampire landed on the ground, his eyes never leaving the small crater that formed beneath the exorcist. The vampire from the House of Teps smirked as he licked the blood off the tips of his fingers, not enough to heal him completely but enough to delay his death for a few more seconds. "Now, remain dead. TCH. The man clicked his tongue, and the Teps roared out, staring a hole towards the crater, watching for any more signs of life. However, much to the vampire's annoyance, the exorcist continued to stand up despite his severe injuries, which included a large bleeding cut on his wounded chest, a trail of blood from the side of his mouth, which was adorned by his busted lips, one of his blue eyes closed, and bruises and batterings all over his body. He wished the battle had ended there and then so that he could pass on. Despite death, he was abnormally composed. As he looked, he noticed that his right arm was hanging limply by his side. He was not an expert in medicine, but based on the appearance of it, several of his bones were probably broken. "I guess my teachers were right when they told me that vampires were not to be trifled with," he said calmly, whispering, "The chances of victory has dropped to a 10%, make that 5%. I may have gotten too cocky but I'll manage." With a flick of his still working hand, a single handle of a holy sword appeared from his sleeve. A blade of light appeared over the shoulder of the swords. As he held the blade firmly in his hands, he turned his head towards his opponent, his chilling blue eyes meeting the vampire's crimson orbs for the first time during the entirety of their death match. "Come, let's finish this battle." Vampire San. "You don't need to tell me, you mongrel." The vampire noble's remaining hand was encircled by a dark haze of demonic, vampiric energy, which made his claw even sharper. "I plan to kill you now." With his eyes focused on the vampire, the blonde said, "Sorry, don't plan on dying anytime soon." He thought he could see everything with his eyes, including his victory. The final confrontation between the vampire and the exorcist was marked by the abrupt passage of a mild wind through the now demolished cemetery. The pair lunged toward each other. There were no dazzling magic tricks or fancy skills, it was just a full-on charge between the fighters. The vampire was the first to move as they got closer, extending his claw in an attempt to decapitate the exorcist with a single, clean thrust of his hand. The ashen-haired nobleman sliced through the man's neck, which proved to be his undoing. The exorcist was about to land the death blow when he spun around at the last second, barely avoiding the deadly blow as his body continued to spin towards the vampire's exposed body. Sheng, however, luck was not on the exorcist's side as the vampire saw the attack coming and managed to bend his neck to the side, making the sword lose its target. The exorcist swung his blade quickly, cutting through the vampire's remaining arm as if it were paper. The exorcist then shifted his grip on his sword and aimed the tip of the saber of light towards the vampire's head, hoping to kill the bloodsucker without delay. The vampire tried to bite down on the exorcist's neck with his elongating fangs in the hopes of retaliating, but the blue-eyed teenager dropped his sword, ducked, and rolled away from his bite. But before he could bite the blonde, the exorcist beat the vampire to the punch by biting his right bicep to raise the limping limb. The exorcist then quickly broke through the vampire's defenses and touched the ashen-haired man's body with both hands. His limp hand landed over the man's already severely injured abdominal area, while his working hand landed on the man's chest. The exorcist whispered, "Sayonara," as a tiny trail of blood fell from his throat, indicating that he narrowly escaped the vampire's fatal blow. "Shay," was the only response the vampire gave. Stab. Stab 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 stab. No fewer than a dozen holy swords wreathed in azure flames erupted from the vampire's back, and more sounds of flesh being torn reverberated around, this time with the sound of sizzling and burning. There was no shrill cry of agony. The blonde exorcist remained vigilant despite the punishment his mortal body had received, while the vampire simply collapsed to his knees, several flaming swords burning through his organs and gradually poisoning him with their holy essence. The winner has already been determined a few meters from the now ruined graveyard, which was full of flaming holy swords, a torrent of blood, and numerous corpses. A smiling blonde-haired teen with green eyes was sitting atop a tombstone, happily eating a hot dog. "Naruto. This is taking too long," the blonde complained in between bites, calling on the other exorcist who had just fought tooth and nail against the vampire noble. This scene quickly broke the seriousness of the situation. The exorcist, who is now Naruto, answered right away, his voice devoid of any signs of weariness or pain, saying, "Don't worry, I'm about to finish this guy off." You poor human. There, don't you despise the Tep's household? Know that hundreds of my relatives will still be around even if you kill me. Believe me when I say that one day you stupid mortal will face the full force of my family's wrath." With his body already disintegrating and turning to gray ash, the injured vampire let out a roar. "All right." This was the bespectacled exorcist's straightforward reply before he used another blade of light in his still working hand to cut off the creature's head, turning the vampire's body to ash and ending the man's life. The teenager made a quick sign of the cross and whispered, "May God have mercy of your soul." Then, to be safe, he poured a vial of holy water over the vampire's ashes to ensure it was dead. "Sizzle. How about that? We evoked the wrath of a whole vampire family upon the Tuas," the exorcist said, turning to face his fellow blonde, blue eyes that gleamed through the darkness with an almost indifferent air as the vampire's body slowly burned and disintegrated to nothingness, leaving behind a venomous scent of death mixed with blood and iron. The other exorcist's slack response was, "I don't really mind, but it will be a hassle to kill all of those things." "Dulio, really?" As he began to approach his partner, who had willingly sat out the fight so that he could fight the vampire one-on-one, Naruto exclaimed, "I thought you could freeze all of their collective asses for shits and giggles." Dulio Jezu, the strongest exorcist and owner of the second strongest Longinus, the Zenith Tempest, also grinned at his friend's remarks. "And I was under the impression that you'd slice all of them up without a care in the world," he joked, alluding to his fellow blonde's propensity to use his swords to cut up most of his problems. "Against hundreds of people? I am aware of my limitations. However, things might be different if I had been born with a Longinus like you." The strongest exorcist. Naruto laughed while leaning against a nearby gravestone. Oh, why would you say that? Oh great descendant of the second sage, I thought you could take down hundreds with a wave of your true holy sword. It was a cold night. Naruto smirked and said, touché. He hesitated for a second as a cool breeze brushed against his body. So, when will the cleanup crew be here? He inquired with his longtime friend. Since I already called them while you were having the fight of your life, then I say they'll be here by dawn. Good. The exorcist with beards said, I really don't want to deal with the populace panicking upon the sight of burning swords and large chunks of ice in their graveyard. Don't forget about the corpses. True, true. By the way, about the truly holy sword, why didn't you use it? Duelio laughed. Duelio pointed to the sheathed sword that was fastened behind Naruto's waist as he asked. I don't always want to rely on it, he said, looking down at the sword around his waist. As a child, he had assumed it was just a family heirloom, but to his amazement, it turned out to be a holy sword that had chosen him to wield it. However, you had the opportunity to greatly ease this struggle, Duelio said. Were you not pleased with my victory over the vampire? In response, Naruto inquired. Rubbing the back of his head, the strongest exorcist said, well, I'm actually happy that you defeated him. Naruto quickly responded, I won and you're happy, that's all that, but he interrupted himself when he heard something that caught both his and Duelio's attention. The sound of flapping wings. The two exorcists turned their heads in the direction of the noise and discovered what appeared to be a pigeon soaring through the night sky. A pigeon carrier? Duelio muttered, his gaze resting on a tiny piece of paper that was fastened to the bird's legs. The bird landed on Naruto's outstretched left hand as he said, is there nobody in the church who knows how to use a phone? As he swiftly untied the little piece of paper tied to the bird's feet, the bespectacled teenager grumbled. As he reached into his pockets and took out a brand new cell phone with a touchscreen, Duelio proudly declared, I know how to use it. You don't count since I've taught you how to use one ever since we were partnered up. With his phone back in his pockets, the most powerful exorcist sulked and said, boo, you're no fun. With his blue eyes focused intently on the message contained within the plain piece of parchment, Naruto abruptly fell silent. Is this a different mission? As he watched his partner go silent for several minutes, probably reading the message several times, Duelio couldn't help but ask. The friend pulled out what appeared to be a small crimson-colored cross from the piece of parchment, and the bespectacled blonde exorcist simply nodded in response before the parchment was abruptly consumed by blue flames. So, Naruto-san, where are you heading? Orders to go back to headquarters first for debriefing, but the message says to prepare myself for a mission to Japan under the orders of one of the seraphs. Whistling with admiration, Duelio said, top-level orders, huh? These days, those are uncommon. This means something is amiss and must be dealt with swiftly. Duelio nodded as his mind figured out what his partner's departure for another mission meant. Suddenly, a light bulb popped up on his head, saying, oh, you mentioned visiting Japan, correct? In response, Naruto nodded and said, yeah, back to my birth country. I haven't been in Japan in a while. Actually, the last time I was there was when the two of us killed those three Kishin. I still remember that I was about to deliver the last blow and you stole the kill from me. You were taking too much time. No, you were simply too indolent. You abruptly made the decision to erase everything from memory, even though I had already killed one of them and was ready to kill my second. I took time to carefully analyze their attack patterns before dishing out divine whoop ass. You just got impatient like always, you lazy butt. Duelio rolled his eyes and said, whatever. Then a light bulb on top of his head flashed. Nay Naruto, could you please bring me something back? His tone remained flat as he responded, I'll bring you some mochi if you promise not to freeze our next enemies to death. Agree. As he pushed himself off the tombstone, Naruto nodded, a faint smile tainting his face. I'll see you around then. Yeah, see you next time. Naruto, stay safe and bring back some mochi. When he began to leave the cemetery's limits, the bespectacled exorcist said, hi. Oh, and Naruto. The exorcist turned to face his fellow blonde and halted his journey. Yeah? You ought to visit the hospital first, right? Duelio made a point. As he looked down at his body, which included his white clothes now stained red, his right arm hanging limp, several severe cuts and bruises, a few broken ribs, and some serious bleeding from all the wounds he had sustained in his battle with the vampire, Naruto raised one eyebrow and whispered, you're right, I didn't notice that, in a tone that was somewhat flat but also showed some surprise, as if he had just noticed the injuries on his person. It appears that I'm losing too much blow, he said, but before he could finish the string of words, the blonde fell face first towards the ground, unconscious. Oshish Naruto. 1 week later. The sound of bells ringing in unison to announce the arrival of noon could occasionally be heard from inside one of the Vatican's many churches. It was a small, unassuming structure, a wood and brick structure built on the blood and sweat of the many lives that formed its foundation. And it did not stand out like other churches in the area because it was situated close to the state's edge, far out of the reach of the masses, though the numerous runes, sigils, and mystical arrays carved inside the church's immaculate white walls, which covered the entire structure in a kind of barrier of invincibility, did help to divert the public's attention. 2 priests stood in front of a wooden door in the halls of this lonely and ethereal church. They were merely 2 elderly men wearing priestly robes and brandishing blades of life, and they were among the many who have dedicated their lives to defending and guarding this most sacred of parishes. To put it another way, they were merely guards for the door leading to the room where the boss frequently lived. Did you hear? In an attempt to break the ice and escape the terrible punishment of boredom, one of the 2 priests, a man with graying features, asked. Well, the other priest, who was older than the other 2 and had white hair, muttered something languidly. Are you familiar with the church's sword? The second priest in the guard nodded and said, Yeah, who doesn't know about him? It seems that sword of the church is descended from him, the younger of the 2 exclaimed with excitement. Everyone who lived in the darker side of the church knew of the man and his feat, but who was the him to whom his younger friend was referring? The older priest's eyebrows were furrowed. He knew who the sword of the church was, but who didn't? The man who saved the world by vanquishing a demonic god. The graying priest said proudly. You recognize the sage from the old Rakudo stories. A descendant of the 6 paths? The older priest asked, his eyes widening in surprise. Is the first one or the second one? Knowing the old legend of the great savior who killed a god and transcended humanity, he asked almost quickly. The second, oh. The church's future is undoubtedly bright, for an old-timer like him. This was pure gold. Let's just hope he doesn't quit from the church like that other descendants, those holy sword users. Such a waste, such a waste. The older of the 2 exclaimed in laughter. If you're talking about that brat who descended from a dragon slayer. The younger priest snorted. The stupid boy left our order and disappeared from the world. The strongest user of the holy sword also abruptly disappeared. Yes, but let's stay on subject. Given that you appear to have access to some of this information, could you please explain how the church obtained such a treasure? According to what I've been told, his descendants' clan was not very socially connected. The younger priest's response was, he was exiled. Banned? Yes, at the tender age of 4 the boy was exiled and sent to the care of the Holy Church, where he was looked after by an executor who later recommended the boy for immediate training after finding out that the boy was not only talented but was also chosen by a holy sword. Yes, there are rumors that he is brandishing a holy sword, but wow, an innate wielder of a holy sword. I never imagined that I would live to witness the day when the sacred blades would select not 1, but 2. Yes, I heard that Griselda Quadra trained him along with the Durandal girl and that prodigy who inherited the Longinus, the younger priest said with a smile and a joyful nod. He. There are rumors that even the great paladin of the betrayer and the whore from those heretical inquisitors helped train him. Of course, those are just rumors. You know, rumors? They might as well be regarded as facts at this point. After all, the tale of the boy's prowess with the blade is likely familiar to you. Seal and Alexander were clearly written on that. Did you say, Longinus brat? He. That insufferable brat, he lets his stomach and palate think for him rather than using that brain of his. The older priest frowned as he recalled his encounter with Dulio. Tell me, who was this executor who discovered the swords when he was a child? He said, shaking his head to divert his attention from the person claiming to be the strongest exorcist. I have to express my sincere gratitude to him for his discovery. What was the child's name? He was the son of the person in charge of that one heretical ritual that those mages are so fiercely loyal to. He was killed in battle against one of those heretics. The last I heard of him, he was apparently a family friend of the boy. The younger of the 2 responded. We were fortunate that he sent the boy here before he was killed in the line of duty. Yes, I am aware of a young man who died so young. He nodded, allowing himself a brief moment of silence in remembrance of the deceased, and said, so tell me, have you seen what the sword of the church looks like? I shall pray his soul. I've never really met him in person and have only heard rumors about his appearance. They say he is of average height, skin slightly tanned, has spiky blonde hair, cerulean blue eyes. He is always wearing a pair of indestructible glasses. He wears a necklace made of Magatama beads. And finally they say he always keeps his holy swords strapped in the lower part of his back most of the time. That is a rather detailed description. Well, the younger priest laughed. I genuinely belong to his fan club because I find it admirable when someone passes judgment on the damned. Amen to that, my fellow priest. Amen. When the two of them burst out laughing, the younger priest cheered. While they were laughing, the two were unaware that a 16-year-old man with blonde hair and glasses was approaching them. He was dressed in white priestly robes and had white bandages wrapped around what were probably multiple wounds on his body. Eventually, the blonde halted a few paces ahead of the two guards, who continued to ignore him and engage in gossip. Using the palm of his left hand to push up his glasses, the teenager sighed and said, "Excuse me," he nearly screamed to draw the two elderly priests' attention. "What are you looking for?" As he glared at the newcomer who had interrupted him from his fanboying ways, the younger priest asked. "I'm here for an appointment today. Can I see any proof?" the older priest asked. Raising an eyebrow, he was aware that the boss had an appointment that day, but was it really with this frail-looking young man? He inquired. Simply reaching into his pocket, the bespectacled blonde took out what appeared to be a small crimson-colored cross and handed it to the older priest, saying languidly, "Here." After examining the cross, not that he did much examining because he could tell right away that it was the authentic seal that the boss frequently used, the older priest said, "You may go in." As he continued to walk in the direction of the doors that the two priests guarded, the bespectacled teenager whispered, "Thank you." "Do I know you? You look familiar." As the blue-eyed blonde walked by, the younger priest asked. Naruto pushed open the wooden door and quickly vanished on the other side, leaving the two guards, priests, to gossip. "No, I don't think we've ever met." It hasn't changed much since Naruto first entered through those very doors when he was 5 or 6 years old. It was still as plain as ever, barely furnished with a few wooden bookcases, a small fireplace, a desk, and several chairs within. Naruto entered the room with a faint smile tugging at the side of his lips. The exorcist's eyes shifted to a man seated in a chair behind the plain wooden desk. He was the same man who had greeted him at this institution years before, and he appeared to have aged nothing. Even though he was in his 70s, he still had a rather large and muscular frame that dwarfed Naruto, and he swore that for a brief moment he actually thought the man was secretly a giant, or at least part bear to be huge, like that he was an elderly man of Middle Eastern descent with short, swept-back silver hair that matched his equally silver but extremely powerful eyes. The man said, "Hello Naruto," in a quiet voice. With a slight bow of his head, Naruto said, "Hello Master Garul," in return to his current superior officer, who was the head of the church faction to which he belonged. When the old, muscular man noticed the bandages on the bespectacled teen's body, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You look a little banged up." "Got pummeled and almost killed by a vampire, no big deal." "Where is Dulio, too? I thought I had requested that you both return to this location." He suddenly got some info about a rare type of curry appearing in India. Naruto was rubbing his head and looking somewhat sheepishly. "He bailed on me at the airport instead of the flight going back here. He rode the one going to India, and truth be told I thought I saw my sensei going on board the same flight." Cradling his hands on his desk, the older man laughed wisely and said, "I guess I'll take care of Dulio later, but your sensei," the silver-haired man produced what appeared to be an ancient typewriter, which caused Naruto to perspire a little. "Well, she's out of my jurisdiction, so I can't do anything about that." Boss. "Yes. I brought you a new PC a few months ago. Where is it now?" "It was broken, so I gave it away." "You were unable to use it, were you not? Is it really the case that every member of the church lacks basic technological skills?" "Naruto, it's because we cherish the traditional way of life. Putting that aside, would you kindly provide me with an update on your most recent mission?" Naruto was unsure of how the enormous man managed to press those tiny buttons with his incredibly large fingers when he placed his enormous digits on top of the typewriter. "Naruto. What? You spaced out on me." For the Tep's house, mission classification rank S. Slaying of a noble vampire was accomplished with difficulty. "Oh, sorry about that." The bandaged exorcist straightened his body to appear more professional and presentable. "Dulio and I collected information after arriving at the scene and discovered that the vampire used a cemetery close to the town as a base of operations. As soon as we learned of it, the two of us attacked their hiding place in the actual battle. Dulio and I faced a noble from the House of Teps in addition to a total of 157 ghouls and small vampires and other enemies. With his permission, Dulio let me fight the vampire alone. And I won after a death-defying battle. Shortly after that, I got your message, but I passed out from my wounds, that's all." The older man whispered, I see," as he typed up the mission's details, and the only sounds in the room were those of the typewriter. Naruto yawned inwardly. He always detested this section because it was so dull. The blonde exorcist turned his head back and forth, searching for something to do for the next few minutes or so because his boss typed slowly. Finally, Naruto's brows lifted as his icy blue eyes looked at the words written on the folder. Benefici venation. A chill went down the blonde's spine when he realized the meaning of those two simple words. It couldn't be, he thought as a number of memories flashed through his head, briefly allowing him to see the face of a good and innocent girl before the sounds of typing finally brought him back to the present. Now it's time for your next mission. Hi. The holy maiden who fell from grace, do you recall? Naruto immediately responded to his superior. Yes, I was the one who was tasked to guard her during her time in Italy. And what was the outcome of that? The mission was considered unsuccessful, he responded, recalling not only his failure but also the time he spent with such a sweet and innocent girl. The holy maiden healed a devil and was thus excommunicated and banished from the church. Well, you appear to recall your previous errors. The older man picked up the folder and said, these orders come from the top, with clearance from one of the great seraphs. He threw the folder at the blonde, who easily caught it. I want you to know that we were lenient towards you because that was your first and only failure on an otherwise spotless record. Naruto opened the folder and began reading the contents, his features not revealing any impression he may have had of this mission, and he remained largely unimpressed. Will you do it? Will you do what our Lord commands? The silver-haired man asked, staring at Naruto as though he were examining his very being. Closing the folder, the bespectacled exorcist set it directly above his superior's desk. All right. With his head pointing to the ground, Naruto knelt on one knee and declared, I am the sword of God who brings judgment upon the world. The teenager answered rapidly and almost robotically, humanity's weapon against the damned. You just need to point me in the right direction and I will bring forth divine retribution. With a smile, the older man with silver hair said, good, go forth and may God be with you on this journey. As he hurriedly stood up and headed for the door, concealing the fact that he was clenching his fists until they were practically drawing blood, Naruto responded, Amen. He only had to kill one person, a heretic banished from the church, whom he knew very well and who gave him a reason to live, the girl with the soft, kind smile. His mission was easy, and rather straightforward. When he saw the words Venation Benefici, he should have known. They were sending him on a witch hunt. He had Ossia Argento to kill. The sun was beginning to set, as evidenced by the orange tint in the sky. The different patrons and employees of the church where the garden was located were already departing for the day by that point, which was late afternoon or early evening. Others went to the city to find entertainment for the upcoming evening. Some returned home to be with their families who were waiting for them, and still others just left without really knowing where they were going in the bleak future. Nevertheless, a young child, perhaps 6, 7, or 8 years old, stood in front of a lovely garden as the late afternoon turned into the early evening. The youngster remained behind even though the church was rapidly being cleared out and no one was left to bar him. He lived in the church, which served as a sort of orphanage, along with a few others. As a result, the boy's blue eyes remained fixed on the lovely blue flowers that were emerging from the different bushes and foliage. Even though time had passed, he was looking at them with great interest, but he wasn't really sure why he was doing it. He simply gazed at the flowers, which seemed strange and mysterious at the same time, and even lovely to his impressionable young mind. The unnaturalness of the blue flower had a certain beauty. He heard a gentle, childlike voice ask, "What ya doing?" which caused him to pause his ministrations for a second and turn to face the speaker. He turned his head to the side and saw a girl with blonde hair who looked familiar. She had a small silver cross around her neck and was dressed in a dark blue nun's habit. She was instantly recognizable to him as Ossia Argento, a girl he had met a few months earlier. As his head slowly turned back towards the garden full of gorgeous blue flowers, he remarked, "I was just looking at the flowers." As she cautiously moved to his side until they were a foot apart, she questioned, "Why?" Naruto answered in a rather flat, passive voice that verged on being emotionless, "I don't know, I just found myself staring at them for no reason." Her features showed confusion as she cocked her head to the side. "I thought you were watching them cause you liked them since they're really pretty." With his eyes still fixed on the blue flowers that were now swaying in the light wind, Naruto began, "I don't dislike them. But I don't like them either. You could say I'm just watching the flowers for the sake of watching them, and nothing else." Asia inquired, "So you don't like watching the flowers?" "I don't dislike it," was his hasty response. Another question came to the mind of the non-habitual girl. "Then you like it?" "I don't not dislike it." She rested her head on her temples and interlocked her fingers with her silky golden blonde hair, saying, "So you don't like the flowers but you also don't dislike it? You're confusing me, Naruto. Do you like these flowers or not?" "Roses." She blinked in surprise, not anticipating her fellow blonde's reaction. "Huh?" she asked. "Those flowers," he said, gesturing to the blue flowers the girl was probably talking about. "They're called roses." "But aren't roses supposed to be red, not blue?" The boy gazed at the blue roses, processing the fact that they weren't naturally blue. "I don't know why they're blue," he said. But what I do know is that Master Garul planted them. He told me they were roses, and since Master said that they were roses, then they must be roses. Then why are they blue? He said, not really understanding why the roses were blue. Perhaps they got tired of being red, so they turned blue? Maybe some chemicals or even magic were to blame. Is that possible? He reached for the roses with both hands and took one by the stem, not particularly caring about the thorns that pricked his tiny hands. We see it with our eyes at this very moment. We're both looking at it and we both see blue flowers. He pulled the flower from the bush with one ferocious pull. He showed his fellow blonde the flower and said, I'm holding it in my hands now. Then it exists. Blue roses are within the realm of reality. The girl exclaimed, Naruto, you're bleeding again. In disbelief as she saw the blood now pouring from his hands. Oh, he muttered in surprise, or at least surprise to him, because he would have sounded flat and uninterested to others. I didn't notice. Mu, you need to take better care of yourself. The nun took hold of his bleeding hands and wrapped them in her own, which were a mysterious shade of green. The cuts and gashes began to heal as soon as they came into contact with his hands with innocent eyes. The girl gazed at the boy's hand and said, I won't always be here to patch you up when you hurt yourself. I'll keep that in mind. You said that the last time. Did I? I forgot. The green glow on her hand faded, indicating that his injured hands had fully healed, and Asia remarked, Mu, well, you better remember this time. He flexed his now healed hands and said, I'll try. He wasn't entirely sure why she was so concerned about his injuries when he bled during training. It was not a huge deal. All that was left were cuts and bruises that eventually held. At that moment, he noticed that the girl was looking down at the ground rather than at him. The boy raised an eyebrow in perplexity and chose to follow the girl's gaze, ultimately settling on the same item that caught her interest. The blue rose he had picked earlier lay on the ground. His blood was on the ground, covering the lovely and majestic blue rose. It looked fantastic. He may still have had the flower in his hands, but he didn't even realize he had let go of it. Apparently, he let go of the flower in between her grabbing his hands and healing them. Without giving it any thought, he knelt down and carefully picked up the flower, taking care not to cut his hands. Would you like it? Before she nodded, she muttered something under her breath that he missed. He carefully plucked the thorny stem of the flower with his hand until only a small portion remained free of thorns. Then he turned to face Asia, who was eagerly awaiting him with his hands clutching the now stemless blue rose, whose petals were slightly tinged red by his own blood. The boy walked several paces in her direction. The boy leaned in Asia's direction and positioned the flower close to her ear. Between her bangs on the left side of her hair, he glanced at the flower and at her, whispering, Here. In all honesty, the boy said, it suits you. As the girl's hands touched the rose in her hair, a flush came over her cheeks. Then she smiled. The same smile that made his chest feel strange and that she had sent her a few days earlier. Thank you. Again, what was it? When people smiled, how did they feel? What was the expression on the face of the girl before him? Yes, Master Garul, one of his teachers, made reference to that feeling if he recalled. It was called happiness. After giving it some serious thought, he muttered, You're happy, right? To make sure he was correct. The girl said, Of course I'm happy. Without hesitation, before her eyes widened, the girl put her hand in her mouth as though she was regretting what she had just said. I'm especially when I'm with you, since we're friends after all. She seemed uncertain as to whether they were truly friends. Was it their friendship that scared her? Were they even friends, though? He couldn't remember her asking him to be friends. Was that it? Did she wish to be his friend? Do you want to be friends? Yes, Asia nearly exclaimed, her eyes wide with hope and the feeling known as happiness. I've never really had friends, so I was really hoping we could be friends. I was going to ask, but you beat me to it, the teenager admitted. Friends? Does being friends with you make you happy? Yep. She exclaimed joyfully. In a matter of seconds, the boy's mind processed hundreds of ideas while he closed his eyes. After a few seconds of silence, the boy opened his eyes and met the nun's naive green eyes with his own blue orbs. Then, as long as you're happy, I'm happy as well. The owner saw a flash of intense light as a pair of blue eyes slowly opened, causing him to briefly close his eyes and blink multiple times. Ugh, stupid sunlight, Naruto moaned as he put his hands over his eyes and rubbed them gently to counteract the cunning effects of the sun's rays, which were visible through the clear blue sky. He yawned a little because he wanted to stretch out, but he was afraid of upsetting the people seated next to him on the train. In order to avoid hitting his fellow travelers, he chose to just extend his arms over his head. Good morning, Shinpu-san, Mr. Priest. I hope you have had a nice nap. Naruto suppressed a yawn and looked at the man seated next to him, a man in his 20s with brown hair and a casual business suit. Naruto said, recalling the dream he had about his early years with Asia, it was a good sleep. I even had a nice dream. Oh, from the sound of it you probably enjoyed your dream, isn't that right, Shinpu-san? As he considered whether the dream was a happy dream or a nightmare, the bespectacled priest honestly responded, "It was so you could say that I liked the dream yet hated it at the same time. It was a dream that reminded him of his mission to kill the same person who was with him in the dream, but it was also a priceless memory." The working man hesitated, trying to come up with a suitable word to use so as not to offend the kind priest in any way. "That sounds rather," he said, "complicated." As Naruto's gaze shifted from the man seated next to him to the clear window at his side, he abruptly ended the conversation by saying, "You could say that." The train passed under the early morning sun, and the urbanized buildings were viewed by cerulean blue orbs. He will reach the city where his old friend now resides, or at least where she was last seen, at one of the stops along this rail line if the information he obtained from multiple sources and representatives of the Japanese churches is accurate. The man with the brown hair said, Shinpu-san. What is it?" Naruto asked nonchalantly, turning back to face the man seated next to him. "I apologize for disturbing you, but I was just wondering if I can ask a favor." "It depends on what it is." The man with the brown hair scratched the back of his head and laughed. "You see, I'm getting married soon and I was just wondering if you could give me your blessings, cause I heard that marriages lasts longer when the couples receive blessings from the church even before their marriage ceremony." "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not the type of priest that gives out blessings to those who are about to get married," Naruto said with a sigh before breaking the bad news to the eager man. The brown-haired man raised an eyebrow and asked, "Then what kind of priest are you, Shinpu-san?" His curiosity was aroused because he believed that priests typically performed a wide range of services rather than just a few. Naruto abruptly ended the conversation with the young man, who by this point had a rather sheepish expression on his face as if he realized his error, by saying, "The one who give people the last rites before they die as well as the one present for funerals and burials." The train's speakers abruptly came to life as he was finishing. "Warning. Passengers. We are now arriving at KUOH station, KUOH station, KUOH station. We are sorry for any inconveniences." Naruto found himself getting to his feet as soon as the train came to a stop. After hearing the announcement, he gave the man an apologetic bow as he passed him and headed for the door, saying, "I apologize for not being able to help, mister, but I do hope you and your wife can live a happy life in the future." The bespectacled teenager nodded to the man as he got off the train, responding to the man's joyful smile. "Ah, it was no problem, thank you for your time, Shinpu-san." As he made his way to the station's exit, the exorcist, still wearing his typical white priestly vestment, reached for his pockets. The blonde pulled a phone, one of those new Android phones, from his pocket without giving it a second thought. The young man with the bespectacled eyes then hurriedly pressed a number of buttons, launching multiple search engines and entering a number of keys before starting the search in a matter of seconds. He was provided with the addresses of two churches in the city. One was relatively new, having been established only a few years ago, while the other was abandoned and set to be demolished soon. The current representative of the church in this town resides in the same establishment. The exorcist nodded his head in satisfaction, shutting down all search engines and his phone before putting it in the back of his pocket. In the middle of a sea of people leaving the train station, Naruto gave a final yawn as he finally left. As he blended in with his surroundings, he said, "Time to get some intel." Naruto arrived at his destination, a modest and charming-looking church close to the train station on the outskirts of Kuo, in less than 30 minutes. It was still early in the morning when he arrived, and the church was empty of parishioners, as he had anticipated. Actually, when he pushed the wooden door leading into the church, he saw that nobody else was there except for a nun kneeling in front of an altar that held up a picture of God's Son nailed to a cross in all its splendor. The nun paused her prayer and got up, as though sensing his unexpected interruption. The nun was in his age range. She has brilliant full eyes and light gray hair that borders on silver. She was dressed in the customary church robes, a hat, and a dark blue nun's habit. A red cloth, which appeared rather plain to the untrained eye, hung around her neck. However, those who were knowledgeable about the mystical arts would recognize the cloth as a sacred object, a sacred cloak. The nun whispered, "Naruto Uzumaki-san, I presume." "Indeed." Naruto nodded his head in agreement as he progressed past the nun and the church's benches until he was halfway between the nun and the altar. "And I'm guessing you're the church's representative in this area as well as the informant that I seek." "It is as you say, Naruto-san. My name is Karen Hortensia and I am the temporary representative of Kuo." In bewilderment, Naruto cocked his head to the side. "Temporary representative? I'm currently filling in for this church until a proper representative can be found. I am supposed to be stationed in Fuyuki, which is a few districts back, but the church found the need to station me here for the moment due to special circumstances," Karen replied with politeness. Naruto nodded, I see, I will not ask what the circumstances entails as I value a person's privacy, but I prefer if you can tell me what I need to know. The girl folded her hands together and placed them around her belly, saying, "Ask and thou shalt receive an answer." To find out if the nun knew anything, Naruto deliberately used the word, fully, to emphasize the question, "Are you fully aware of the happenings in this city?" Of course I am aware of the happenings of this city, be it the normal daily occurrences of men or the dastardly events of the world which you and I belong to. For example, just a few days back a stray devil plagued the lands, killing a few humans until the heathen itself was slayed by a devil, specifically the peerage of one of the two devil representatives of this land. The gray-haired nun answered, her golden-colored eyes showing no indication of deception. Naruto asked himself, do they belong to the 72 pillars? Reluctantly, the church's temporary representative responded, the Gremory in Citri. Naruto noticed that his eyes were opening up a little in shock. Among the 72 pillars, those were two well-known names, the former family of two of the four Satans. Indeed, so if your mission has anything to do with regards to them, then I suggest you abandon it, since it would be nothing more than suicidal. Yes, you might defeat them, but an angry Mao will not bode well for the current balance between the three factions. Not really wanting the girl to believe that he was some kind of renegade exorcist who was out to start a war between the three factions, he clarified, then we're lucky that I have no plans to even touch a hair of their family. Rather, my target is someone who everyone in the church should be familiar with. The nun's turn came to pose the query, and who is your target? Not bothering to conceal who his target was, Naruto responded, Asia Argento. After all, he needed Karen to verify Asia's location. The fallen maiden. The nun, who was undoubtedly familiar with the tale of the holy maiden who fell from grace, gazed sorrowfully down at the ground. The nun bowed her head slightly and made the sign of the cross, sending a silent prayer to the biblical God. Amen. Such a pity, may God have mercy on her soul. Before posing his next query, Naruto waited for the nun to finish her prayer. Do you know her whereabouts, or at least can you confirm if she really is in this town, much like my informants have told me? Your information is rather accurate. She has been spotted in this town recently. Asia Argento is most likely with the group of heretical exorcists and fallen angels that came to the city about a week ago. Fallen angels in the middle of devil territory? Karen gave a slow nod. I was lucky enough that they haven't attacked this church. The old church further within the city, however, wasn't so luck, as it was made into a pseudo-base of operations for the angels. And where did you get this information from? My familiars, they're able to scout through the city undetected. Naruto muttered. I see. Her explanation made sense because he was well aware that some familiars were skilled at spying. Do you know where Asia is normally seen? With a thoughtful expression, the nun put her hand on her chin and said, she's mostly seen in the parks around the city, and aside from that the girl also frequents the shopping district. Naruto turned around, his back to the nun, and bowed his head slightly in gratitude, saying, thank you for your help. Oh, you're going to soon? Yes, I have a mission to carry out. The woman closed her eyes and gripped the rosary around her neck, saying, very well, then may God guide you along your mission. May he give you the courage to face all adversity, the strength to vanquish your foes, and the wisdom needed to make the right decision. Amen. Leaving the silver-haired nun behind, Naruto walked out of the church with a robotic, amen. He couldn't place it, but for some reason, the girl just seemed so familiar. The exorcist shrugged inwardly and walked out of the church toward the city. Issei Hyodo has spent the majority of his life as what can be described as a pitiful, perverted individual with no hope for the future. His life, however, took a significant turn a few weeks ago. The brown-haired second-year Kuo Academy student was killed on his first date by his girlfriend, who turned out to be a fallen angel and, based on her attire, a fallen angel with a fetish for S&M or bondage, after a string of unfortunate events. The first date was the worst ever if it weren't for the fact that his crimson-haired senpai Rias Gremory saved him from his deathbed and transformed him into a low-class devil. It would also likely be regarded as his worst and final day on Earth. Yes, Issei Hyodo was no longer human, a perverted entity. Issei, who had been reborn, described himself as a pitiful devil with no talent and a somewhat better but more chaotic future. Actually, aside from learning that he possessed amazing superpowers that allowed him to replicate the Kamehameha attack, unexpected life or death experiences with insane priests, tit-flashing monstrosities, and whatever the hell Miltan is, not much has changed in Issei's life. Miltan, he swore that whatever the hell the thing was, it wasn't human, and that name still terrifies him. It might have been worse than a devil. Even though he wasn't thinking about his time as a devil, he was fortunate enough to go on a date with Asia Argento, a naive blonde nun whom he had enjoyed seeing multiple times over the past few days. Normally, he would be in perverted mode, but the lovely nun's pure innocence made him realize he had protective instincts he was unaware he had. It was truly unfortunate that Asia seemed to be associated with that deranged exorcist who not only massacred his customers but also nearly killed him. Unfortunately, he was still able to get back in touch with the girl and even enjoy going on a date with her in spite of that. Unfortunately, the date was cut short when Asia was kidnapped by Yuma, or Rainier as she now called herself, who appeared out of nowhere. He would have punched her in the face when she kidnapped Asia if it weren't for her boobs and the fact that she was stronger than him. Damn S&M fetishist, fallen angel of an ex-girlfriend. Issei immediately made plans to save the nun because he was now the kind and resolute person that he was. To his fury, Buckow's gorgeous and buxom king Rias Gremory ordered him to leave the girl to her fate. He obviously disagreed with this notion and responded angrily to Rias's reprimand by rashly running in the direction of the deserted church where Asia was held. Luckily for him, the charming but strong Rook Kanoko Tojo and the blonde, attractive boy swordsman Yuto Kiba agreed to accompany him in his attempt to free the girl from the grasp of her malevolent captors. However, in order to plan their attack, the three of them chose to wait until nightfall before attacking the enemy's stronghold, even before they could attack the church in a different universe. Their plan would have been successful, but unfortunately, fate had other plans for them all. Unbeknownst to the young devil, a pair of icy blue eyes observed from a distance throughout his date and Asia's kidnapping. The icy blue eyes belonged to a young man Issei would soon learn was his adversary. One Naruto Uzumaki's icy blue eyes were among them. Prior to the church being attacked by Issei and company, the city and its people were now asleep, unaware of what was happening during the dark hours of the night, as the sun had set and the moon had risen, and darkness had returned and engulfed the sky. The executioner of the church, Naruto Uzumaki, the notorious hound of the Vatican who was known for his ability to rip through all of his opponents, stood in front of an abandoned church that housed not only Asya Argento but also a few fallen angels and probably a few renegade exorcists. With his icy blue eyes fixed on the wooden door leading to the enemy's base, the exorcist's face was emotionless. Should he actually murder her? However, the young man with the bespectacles stood idly by. She was, after all, a sweet and gentle girl who was a victim of her circumstances and the cunning of the devils who deceived her into doing something that was forbidden. Despite the fact that if he didn't kill her, many people would be upset and depressed, he felt that it was better to kill one person to satisfy the majority. Many people would be pleased to learn that the fallen maiden has died in this instance. However, she is Asian, the first on what he believed to be a small list of individuals he valued, individuals he was certain he would sacrifice his life for in the event of a crisis when he was hurt. The sweet and gentle girl took care of him when he was younger. The sweet girl tried to play with him, the guiding and comforting light that glowed in the shadows of his childhood. Is it right for him to kill her? To murder his first friend in order to protect the church? For the benefit of many people's happiness, Naruto steeled his nerves, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. His mind has already gone into overdrive in an attempt to find a solution. The girl was dead on his feet at the end of nearly all of them. Naruto was startled out of his reverie by a faint pulse of demonic essence emanating from the vicinity. The teenager muttered, "Asia," and then shook his head rapidly. There was no more time for hesitation. The devils had to step in and make this situation worse. From this point on, he would use his swords to kill anyone who stood in his way. There are no exceptions. Play the Battle of Brs Ost for Black Rock Shooter. After inhaling deeply, Naruto clapped his hands together. Kekai no Jutsu. Shishi Engine. Barrier Technique. 4 Violent Flames Battle Encampment, he screamed. A large rectangular barrier that glowed brightly was created by 4 holy swords that he had previously embedded around the church's perimeter. Each sword released streams upon streams of sacred blue flames, which engulfed the barrier, which was now composed of intense pure blue sacred flames. The blessed papyrus, which was attached to the handle of the blades, was slowly burning. It contained a variety of seals, symbols, and runes that served as a catalyst and a timer for the construction of this 4-cornered barrier, burning everything that came into contact with its walls, whether from the inside or the outside. As Naruto began to walk toward the church's main gate, he exclaimed, "This will last me a good 30 minutes. The exorcist had to jump back multiple times before he could even take 2 steps, until his back was close to the same barrier he had built to avoid 3 spears of light. A somewhat arrogant female voice asked, "Oh, what do we have here, a human?" An elderly-sounding man complained, "I was expecting some devils to attack us, but instead we get a human." The girl's tone was rather childish as she said, He looks so weak. Nay guys, can I kill him?" Naruto turned to face the source of the voices and discovered 3 fallen angels perched atop an ancient tree. When he had finished setting up his barrier, he could see the 3 fallen angels leaving the church, so he wasn't shocked to see them. "Why did you attack me?" The youngest, a blonde girl, laughed out loud, saying, "Ha ha ha ha, a human like you expects us to answer your questions? That's the best joke I've heard in years." The buxom fallen angel grinned and said, patronizingly, "We don't answer to you, human." With his arms folded across his chest, the lone man in the group yelled, "Che, know your place, mongrel." When the exorcist first saw the three, he thought they were haughty. Because he was only human, a creature they probably viewed as inferior to devils, angels, and fallen angels, he could already tell by their words that they were underestimating him. He remembered being taught as a child that everything in the world could be used as a weapon in order to destroy his enemies. The exorcist could undoubtedly take advantage of their conceit, superiority complex, and condescension. He would be up against a fight if the fallen angels took him seriously because, in essence, they were both magically and physiologically superior to him. However, if they believed that he was just another human being who could be killed with a single throw of their spear, they were terribly mistaken. The three spent a good 3 minutes demeaning and making fun of him, but he didn't really pay attention. He ignored them even when they introduced themselves. He simply chose to carefully avoid every spear they threw at him while he waited for one of them to lose patience and do something careless and foolish. No, he didn't care about that or anything else they said at the time. One of the fallen angels finally broke, just as he had predicted. The group's smallest member was a girl with blonde hair and a small frame who held a lance of light in her hand. She then made the careless decision to charge at Naruto, probably believing that he was easy pickings because, after all, almost any human with a reasonable understanding of magic can create a barrier, and what he did was nothing out of the ordinary. Whoosh! The fallen angel flew through the air at a speed that would have confused ordinary people, heading directly for the blonde with the bespectacles. The side of the exorcist's lips pulled into a tiny smile. He was prepared to show them that underestimating your opponent was a mistake. As he closely watched his approaching opponent, his eyes did their job. The exorcist felt compelled to shake his head at the fallen angel's charge. Almost instantly it was straightforward and direct. In fact, it would have worked if she had the speed to support it, but she was slower than the vampire he had just slain. On the other hand, her attack was so predictable that he could easily land a counterattack or, better yet, a killing blow without even looking at her. The odds were 99% for winning, 50% for delivering a death blow in a single blow, 30% for killing the opponent in 2 blows, and 19% for maiming the opponent and then killing her with the subsequent attack. He was quite pleased with his chances. Therefore, the exorcist did nothing but wait until he could reach the girl. The blonde fallen angel was grinning smugly because her target remained motionless, which made it simpler for her to deliver what she believed to be her own fatal blow. Swish! The fallen angel thrusted her spear of light forward in a single, fluid motion, and her smug expression did not go away as she watched her weapon get closer and closer to her target and ending his pitiful life. The exorcist then made a move. The exorcist let himself follow her attack. Just as her spear was ready to strike his chest, he took a step to the side and easily avoided her blow, his body moving as smoothly as water, and then he whirled around the length of her spear until he was able to get closer to her. His icy blue eyes briefly locked with the fallen angel's own azure eyes. The fallen angel was caught off guard as the exorcist's right hand suddenly swung towards her and grabbed her by the back of her head. After that, Naruto twisted his body and used the momentum of the fallen angel against her. The teenager used his hand to channel some of his chakra before violently smashing her face against the barrier he had created, which was designed to burn anything that came into contact with it, whether from the inside or the outside. The blonde fallen angel let out a cry of agony instantly, and her body trembled and shook violently as her skin began to heat up and eventually burn. The fallen angel's face was covered in smoke, and the skin, muscle, and bones of her face were severely burned when they came into contact with the flaming barrier. The air was filled with the smell of flesh. Stab! Squelch! Only when the exorcist stabbed her through the head with a holy sword between his fingers did her agonized cries of pain cease, instantly killing her. He only needed to make 2 moves in order to kill the fallen angel. Naruto whispered, "That's one down." He let go of the fallen angel's body and let it drop lifelessly to the ground, splattering the head's burnt contents everywhere, creating an agonizing scene of pure blood. He deliberately used a bored tone to provoke his adversary by asking, "So who's next?" The buxom, dark-haired fallen angel, wearing an overcoat, yelled, "You bastard!" as she charged in his direction in blind rage. A rage that the exorcist was already preparing to exploit for his own gain. He could see that she intended to simply stab him with her spear, just like the first fallen angel tried, as she charged at him like a crazy bull that was only seeing red. After the initial attempt, she ought to have realized that this kind of strategy would not be detrimental to him. In contrast to the first fallen angel, he prevented the second one from approaching him with a wave of his hands, 4 holy swords of light materialized in each hand. The executor threw all 8 blades at the approaching fallen angel with accuracy and nearly instinct before scurrying to his side to avoid the blow. All 8 of the blades dug into her body because she was charging at him with full force and was unable to avoid them. 2 of the holy swords pierced through both of her wings, making them useless, and 2 were stabbed on each arm, one through her forearm and bicep and the other through her palms, almost slicing her arm vertically. The other 2 found their way into her legs, pinning her to the ground, and the final 2 found their way to vital areas, sticking out of her back, one around her liver and the other in her chest. Fallen Angel, wearing a trench coat, screamed in excruciating pain as he fell to the ground as the charge came to a sudden stop. As the fallen angel continued to scream in agony and curse him out, Naruto sighed and looked down at her, saying, "Let that be a testament for not only underestimating your opponent but also attacking in blind rage." "Now that's 2, Naruto ducked and rolled away as soon as he said those words, avoiding being mowed down by the only male fallen angel in the vicinity. Swish. The exorcist then turned to face the man in the fedora and carefully avoided every thrust of the man's spear, high, low, mid, left, and right, because he soon grew accustomed to the man's speed and could respond appropriately. A few feet from the body of the first fallen angel he killed, the bespectacled blonde backflipped to evade another broad arcing swipe from the man's sacred spear. "According to the male fallen angel, I suppose you'll do for a warm-up human. So you don't think I'm strong for defeating your comrades? They were weak. That's what you expect from women. The only thing they're good at is opening their legs and seducing others, unlike me. I am a warrior. A fallen angel born for combat. You just got lucky against those whores." "So am I weak?" the fallen angel bragged. "Compared to me, yes. A pitiful human like you can never be as strong as me," while pointing his spear of light. Even though he had already demonstrated his abilities by defeating both of the man's allies, the man continued to underestimate him. In conclusion, what a fool the last fallen angel is. Naruto suppressed a sigh, wondering why he kept running into mythical and paranormal beings. Why must they constantly despise him for being a human? He would have been long dead if any of them had taken him seriously from the beginning. But, since everything is a weapon on the battlefield, he loved to take advantage of the fact that arrogance was the downfall of many of those creatures. In an attempt to agitate the final fallen angel, Naruto grinned and said, "Then why don't you come at me with all that you have?" The exorcist pointed boldly at his chest. He mockingly stated, "Here, stab me through the heart, O Great One," in an attempt to agitate the fallen angel. As he hurled his holy spear at the blonde's chest, the fallen angel roared, "Tisk! Who the hell do you think you are to tell me what to do, whelp?" The blonde leapt away from the spear's path, causing it to miss its target entirely. "You need to do better than that, old-timer." With his wings flapping more violently and creating more wind, the sharply dressed man let out a growl. The man lifted into the air with a single, powerful flap. The fallen angel screamed, "I've had enough of you, human," as he produced another of his holy spears in his hand. Then, just like the other fallen angels, the fallen angel swung straight toward him, spear in hand. Did they truly believe he was that helpless? As he got ready to battle the fallen angel, Naruto muttered, "You can have all the strength in the world, but it won't matter as long as you can't hit me with it." The blonde timed the fallen angel's charge before leaping over the man, reenacting exactly what had happened to the vampire he had battled a few weeks earlier. But rather than showering his target with flaming swords, the blonde decided to simply hurl 8 of his holy swords at the man, who stabbed him multiple times and pinned him to the ground, only a few inches from the fallen angel still wearing a trench coat. His downfall was caused by his arrogance. 2 holy swords materialized in his hands as he hit the ground. "Damn you," choked out the female fallen angel, who was still breathing. Instead of listening to her, Naruto clashed both of his swords, igniting both blades with blue flames as a spark flashed. The male fallen angel tried to push himself off the ground but was pinned by the swords and was unable to do so. What are you doing?" he asked. "Purifying your souls, O arrogant creatures who fell from the light." He approached the 2 living fallen angels, who were writhing in agony or struggling to stand, slowly, pausing a few paces apart. He lifted both of his azure-washed swords into the air and said, "Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust." The exorcist stabbed one of the blazing swords into the bodies of the fallen angels, a female and a male, who were still alive. At the same time, the other swords that impaled the 2 were instantly engulfed in torrents of blue flames from each blade as soon as they dug through their skins, gradually burning the 2 fallen angels to nothingness. He released his hold on each blade and made the sign of the cross, saying, "May God forgive you for your sins." He walked away from the 2 slowly burning bodies and headed for the church, saying, "Amen." The terrible, agonized cries of the fallen angels reverberated through the night sky. At the same moment, that day felt like the longest day of Issei Hyodo's life because the young devil tried to persuade his bucko to assist him in saving Asia. As soon as he woke up, the high-ranking devil was obviously opposed to this endeavor, but it wasn't for nothing because the knight Yuto Kiba and the rook Kaneko Tujo chose to join his group in the hopes of saving his newest friend. Following that recruitment, the young devil hid in the shadows of a building close to the abandoned church where the nun was being held captive for the entire day while he, Kiba, and Kaneko prepared to attack the enemy's stronghold. However, a bluish barrier of fire formed around the area before they could even sneak in from behind the enemy's base. Had Kiba not hurriedly pulled him and Kaneko back, they would have likely been burned alive by those intense blue flames, which are considered holy flames. Yuto initially suggested a tactical withdrawal, claiming that the person who erected the barrier was beyond their capabilities. However, Issei, being the man that he was, refused to back down and persuaded the other two to attempt to enter the church through a different route. Instead of finding a passageway or other opening, they saw a young man who appeared to be about their age, dressed in white, giving him the appearance of a priest, standing in front of the wooden gates leading to the abandoned church. 3 haughty-looking fallen angels were flying above the man. It would have been an understatement of the century to say that they were shocked by what they saw. Soon after, the 3 were in awe of what they saw. The events they witnessed could only be described as a one-sided slaughter. They were not even engaged in combat. In just a minute or two, the man, whoever he was, methodically defeated all 3 fallen angels without even getting hurt or perspiring. Furthermore, it didn't take a genius to see that this man was clearly dangerous because he was also in charge of the barrier that prevented them from entering the church. Who exactly was this man? Standing outside the barrier where they must wait, Kiba and Kaneko thought helplessly that they did not want to meet the same fate as the first fallen angel, who met a rather grisly end. While watching the scene, Eyes, on the other hand, gritted his teeth in rage. According to his observations of the blonde's movements, the man was as swift as Kiba and stronger than he was. The young wielder of sacred gear felt compelled to curse his weakness. "Stay safe, Asia," Eyes muttered, his fists clenched tightly enough to extract blood. For the time being, he will have to wait and let the exorcist decide the nun's fate, but all he wanted was to break through the barrier and enter the church to save his friend. After 15 minutes, blood was splattered on the walls of the deserted church, organs were spilled, appendages were sliced, and pieces of meat and gore were strewn all over the floor. The stench of charred flesh from burning remains filled the air to such an extent that most people who entered the scene would have recoiled at the sight of the bloodshed as well as the gruesome stench of death. Those who stood in the way of Naruto Uzumaki, the Hound of the Vatican and the Sword of God, met this fate. Along with the dozens of exiled exorcists who stood in his way, including one familiar-looking exorcist with silver hair who immediately fled upon seeing him, this fallen angel looked down on him, just like the other 3 outside. Rainier, a lone fallen angel, was about to suffer the same fate. There was a simple chapel in the deepest parts of the church, and it had a mystical altar unlike any other, a straightforward altar with runes and magical circles that was used in a ritual to forcefully take the gifts that God had given to humans. But rather than serving its intended function, the altar held an angel who had lost her way and fallen from God's grace, not a person with divine gifts. Rainier was kneeling on the ground, her legs pinned to the ground, her hands impaled into the altar by swords of light. Her legs were constantly burning with blue flames, causing unspeakable pain as the swords sliced through their meat and bones. The cold-blooded murderer in front of her cut off and burned the wings of which she had once been proud. His robes, which had once been white and pure, were now splattered red with blood as he continued to gaze down at her indifferently, as though she were a bug with no wings that couldn't escape a larger predator. "No, no. This can't be happening," she cried out in tears as she screamed in agony. This was not how it was meant to end. In order to please her master and avoid being the target of a raging human, she was to remove the sacred gear from the nun's body. No, he was a beast, a demon, a monster, not a human, she yelled. "I don't deserve this. No, no, no," as a set of icy blue eyes continued to stare at her. Her killer's blue eyes met hers as he knelt before her. With a tone as cold as ice, he said, "I kindly asked you to surrender, but you didn't heed my warning. Instead of surrendering, you mocked me and assumed I was inferior to you because I'm a human unlike you. That's the reason I won and you lost. Simple as that." She mumbled, "I was so close to completing my plans." By this point, her mind already weakened by the pain. The exorcist stood up slowly, his robes fluttering in spite of the lack of wind, and shook his head. Naruto asked, "Have you said your prayers?" as a sword materialized in each hand's grasp. Aye. She trembled in terror, her life flashing before her eyes, blood-red tears now pouring down before the church's executor severed her head from her body. She cried out, "Azazel-sama." As the fallen angel's head rolled on the ground, a pained expression permanently etched on her face, the blonde whispered, Amen. The blades of his mass-produced holy swords dematerialized, and then the handles of the swords themselves vanished inside the sleeves of the blue-eyed exorcist's clothing. Before taking a deep breath and turning to face the last person in the chapel, the only one who had witnessed his spectacular macabre death, the exorcist said angrily, "How foolish if you surrendered. You could have suffered a painless death, you just made it harder for yourself." Looking at the young woman in front of him from head to toe, he instantly recognized the changes on her body and said, "You've grown since I've last seen you." In more ways than one, he made a joke in an attempt to lighten the atmosphere, but it was a complete failure because the girl simply stared at him bewildered. Probably missing his joke, he sighed inwardly. Was he the only one in the church with a sense of humor and jokes? The blonde shook his head and inhaled deeply again to get his mind straight. His soft words, "It's been a long time, Asia," caused the girl's eyes to widen a little in recognition. She last saw him a few years ago when he served as her bodyguard, but he hasn't really changed. He possessed the same spiky blonde hair, stunning yet icy blue eyes, and a face that displayed subtle emotions. She believed that Issei would be the only person to come here and save her from her captor, her childhood friend, whom she loved. "Naruto!" the girl exclaimed joyfully as she rushed over to embrace the young man, oblivious to the somewhat distressed look on his face. "It's been so long," she exclaimed, gripping the blonde more tightly, oblivious to the blood-soaked clothes he was wearing. Play the piano version of the Jigoku Shouju Ost, Izomi. After their brief reunion, her fellow blonde's first words were, "Asia, do you know why I'm here?" She gave him a cute little tilt of the head as she looked up at him. The girl asked innocently, "To save me?" His arrival was seen by her as a divine miracle, a response to one of her prayers that the Lord answered. He shook his head and pushed her away just enough to break their embrace and make her move a few paces away. He inhaled deeply, strengthening his resolve as he told her about his friend's missions. "I was sent by the church to kill you." Asia felt the world crumble around her, and her eyes grew wide. What? How can that be? Why would they? She was unable to complete any of her sentences. A few words escaped her lips, but none of them adequately captured her feelings. "It's because they want to appease the masses. You see, after you left, rather than calming down, the loyal followers of the church demanded that you were to be executed, beheaded, burned to a stake, or stoned. It really did not matter which method, but their wishes were clear. They want you to die, Asia," he admitted with a vengeance as he confronted nuns. After pausing to take a deep breath, he gave the girl a few seconds to take it all in before breaking into a smile. With an almost imploring tone, Naruto said, "But to hell with them. Do you want to live? Asia, you're my friend, and I would do anything for you if you want to. I can fake your death and bring you to a secluded place, away from the eyes of the church. You will no longer see any of us after that, but you shall live." Naruto was certain that he could form a false body using alchemy or even necromancy. All he needed was a body, one that was exactly like hers. If he burned that body until it was unrecognizable, he might be able to save her life and make everyone else happy. Indeed, one of his main tenets was that the happiness of the many outweighs the happiness of the few. For a brief moment, the nun gazed into his eyes, which were normally stoic blue but now had a hint of desperation that seemed so strange to the blonde. Asia shook her head and grinned pitifully. The girl abruptly fell silent, as if carefully considering her next move. "No, I can't accept that. I don't wish to get you in trouble, Naruto. If they find out, they'll excommunicate you like they did to me or worse. That and," then she said. "And?" She looked a little dejected as she recalled the enjoyable times she had spent with Issei. "I found people here who became my friends much like you were before I left the church. One even took me out on a date and brought me around the area. He showed me a lot of stuff and experienced a lot of things that I didn't know was possible." Knowing that this was a possibility, Naruto sighed inwardly. "Is it the devil boy with the brown hair?" He couldn't resist asking, inadvertently disclosing that he was observing her, indicating that he was fully aware of the girl's brief encounter with the devil. "I would have preferred to have stayed here with them if it had been feasible, but I understand what you do. I know and I am aware of what you need to do," the nun responded, albeit hesitantly. A moment of silence passed between them as the blonde exorcist started to consider his options. One option that would guarantee Asia's happiness but also require him to break a taboo, an act that would make her into the target of his hunt and kill, came to mind. "Are you happy?" His voice was emotionless as he asked. "What? Are you content? And I mean genuinely content to be in this city, even though devils are all around you? Away from the church, away from me." He muttered the final line, mainly to himself, and it appears that not even Asia heard the depressing words, which would have probably influenced her reaction. "Yes, I'm genuinely content here. I'm as happy as the times we spent together as kids. Before everything fell apart, I was happy when I experienced this joy. I wish you were here with me, but I know that's not possible." She paused to take a deep breath, steadied herself, and her eyes gleamed with determination. You have a lot of responsibilities and I know that you're needed in other places. If just give me permission to be selfish this one time, if I'm permitted to be selfish even once in my life. I see. Naruto closed his eyes. If that was her decision, there was no way to avoid what was about to happen. He was taking a risk. He had a 100% chance of completing his mission. But Asia had a very slim chance of surviving this encounter. He would respect her choice. You know what that means, right? Asia gazed at Naruto for what seemed like an eternity before his words finally made sense. Yes, the naive maiden said, her eyes threatening to well up with tears, the first of many to fall. He softly whispered, "Please don't cry," as he wiped a single tear from her lovely face. "However, you will contaminate your hands with my blood. You're going to sacrifice yourself for," the exorcist said, moving his hands and gently trailing them down on her cheek before leaning in to give the nun a gentle, chaste kiss. That prevented her from saying anything more. The nun thought time had stopped as the teenager who had been her first friend, her only friend before coming to Kuo, and her former bodyguard kissed her. If it weren't for the seriousness of the situation, she would have been squealing with delight or stunned, but the act itself almost made her eyes water. He said in a kind and gentle tone, "It's a burden I'm willing to carry for your sake." Eventually, their lips parted, and they shared a fleeting kiss. "But this is wrong. This will make you sad. If my sadness can make you happy, I hate to see it when people I care about are sad," Naruto said, looking at her with a hint of warmth that only a select few have ever seen in his life. "So please smile," he pleaded. "I wouldn't mind it at all if it could make other people happy." She made a vain attempt to smile as tears started streaming from her eyes. "See, can you do something for me?" Without hesitation, he answered, "Anything you want." "Will you say a prayer for me?" she begged. "You want me to pray for you?" he asked, closing his eyes and turning away from the girl who was now crying. His voice was gentle and soft as he asked. "I haven't witnessed you pray before, not even in church, though even as we grew together, it didn't. You never prayed, for whatever reason, so please pray for me if you don't mind. I only ask that you do that." "Are you certain?" The girl's eyes continued to well up with tears, but she just nodded silently. As he reached for the holy sword strapped to his back, he slowly unsheathed it from its scabbard, which was wrapped in multiple suppression seals to block out the majority of its holy essence. "If that is your wish." Naruto closed his blue eyes and recited a prayer, one of the few he said outside of combat. "May he support us all the day long, till the shades lengthen, and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done." She at least deserved to be killed by his most powerful weapon, the fabled true holy sword that his ancestors stole from the corpse of a malevolent dragon who threatened to harm his children if he was going to kill her. It was one of the second sage's 3 sacred treasures. Tsurugi no Kusanagi. Even Asia, who knew very little about swords, thought it was beautiful when the blonde teenager fully extended his magnificent blade, which was about 25 or 26 inches long, moderately curved, and slender. The single-edged blade that rose from its guard-less handle promised an absurd amount of sharpness unlike anything she had ever seen on the face of the earth, and it seemed as though simply looking at the silver holy edge was enough to make her feel both the sharpness of the sword and the immense amount of holiness that just radiated from it. "It's beautiful," the nun thought, as she listened to the exorcist's prayer, admiring the beauty of the pure white and sacred blade. He muttered the final words of the prayer as he closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was about to happen. "There in his mercy may he give us a safe lodging, and a holy rest, and peace at the last." When Asia realized that the prayer had ended and that her friend's final request had been fulfilled, she whispered, "Amen." The nun then found herself closing her eyes as well. "Amen." Naruto's low, soft voice reverberated throughout the deserted chapel's grounds. He opened his eyes and instinctively aimed his blade over the nun's chest. Then with a single, quick thrust, the exorcist stabbed Asia Argento in the heart. After allowing himself a few seconds of silence, the exorcist withdrew the nun's sword, causing it to slowly fall to the ground. Her life essence rapidly dwindled as a tiny pool of blood formed around the wound. She was dead in a matter of seconds, lying in a pool of her own blood on the ground. He wiped her blood off his blade with a flick of his wrist and put it back in its sheath. Looking down at her body, Naruto made the sign of the cross, noting that she was smiling kindly even though she had died. She appeared so serene, calm, and lovely, like that faraway recollection of the past. She had the appearance of a blue rose, a stunning blue rose in the middle of a red puddle. He did experience a little pain in his chest at the sight of what he had done, but by that point, there was no more space for regret. The done is the done. All he could hope was that this was a good thing. The only sign of light in the long, dark hallway was the flickering of a tiny orange flame. The boy was holding a candle, which was the source of the tiny flame that blazed brightly in the shadows. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, who moved silently down the dim hallway, using the little light as a guide. One of the boy's mentors, Garul, a big, strong man with silver hair and eyes, was walking a few paces behind the youngster. "Do you remember Father Paulo?" The old man's deep baritone voice rang in the boy's ears, breaking the ice between them and causing him to nod silently in agreement. The older man said, "Can you tell me something about the good father?" The younger boy gave another nod, then opened his mouth to answer the question. "Father Paulo, he was good. He took care of I and a bunch of others kids in the orphanage a few years ago. He was nice, funny, and smart at the same time. He was the one who read me stories about the church and also the one who taught me how to read and write." "I see. Is there a problem, master?" The older man took a few steps forward and easily passed the boy without bothering to answer. The boy ran as fast as he could, being careful not to drop the candle, after the old man motioned for him to quicken the pace before he could question why his mentor was acting in that way. When they came to a door at the end of the hallway, the older man and boy eventually stopped walking after a few seconds. "Child, yes. Master? Once we enter this room you shall follow all my orders, understood?" The boy gave a nod. "I will, master." The boy only missed the ghost of a smile in the older man's face because of the darkness that surrounded the hallway and the flame's constant shrinkage. The man put his hand on the wooden door and said, "Good." He then opened the wooden entrance with a single, smooth push. Then the two went into the room. It was a spooky room with grimy gray walls that were occasionally glowing a menacing red due to the various symbols and runes scrawled on them, with the exception of a single light bulb that glowed brightly on the ceiling and illuminated a single chair in the center of the space where a man wearing blood-soaked tatters and a black sack on his head sat, or rather was bound into. The room was also empty and devoid of any furniture or furnishings. Garul walked to the center of the room and placed his hand on the black bag covering the man's face. With a single, quick motion, he pulled the bag off, revealing to the boy the familiar face of his gagged old caretaker, Father Paulo. "Your task today is both easy and necessary for your advancement in the arts of an exorcist." The boy's attention was drawn to the rattling sound of steel, and as he looked around, he noticed a knife on the ground a short distance from his feet. The teacher of the boy ordered, "Kill him." After examining the knife for a while, the boy bent over and accepted it in the palm of his hand. He walked a few paces in the direction of the restrained man, who gazed at him with terrified eyes that bore no resemblance to the warm, glowing eyes he had seen as a child. The pastor in the chair and the knife in his hand were the objects of blue eyes that darted back and forth between them every few seconds. "Why are you hesitating, my child?" "Because he was nice to me." "I thought you said that you were going to follow all of my orders?" "But why? Why'd I need to kill him?" From the older man's lips came a sigh. He was seen reading, studying, and incorporating the Quran, the holy text of Islam, into the teaching of the church. "You know full well that the text is banned from the church, and for breaking the law of God he deserves death, a one-way trip to the flames of hell where you will burn for all eternity." After taking a few steps, the older man paused behind his pupil and put both of his hands on his shoulder. "For breaking the laws of God he is considered a demon, a devil, a heretic, a heathen. He brings forth sadness and misfortune. He must die, he must perish according to the laws of our Creator." Even though the boy's eyes were still hesitant, the old man chose to reiterate his previous command, "Kill him." Naruto glanced down at the knife and asked, "Is this right?" With a gentle, grandfatherly tone, the priest declared, "It is, my son. It is. Tell me, when have I ever lied to you?" His pupil remained silent for a while, seemingly lost in thought, before answering, "Never, Master Garul." The older man said, barely suppressing a smile as he watched a glimmer of insight envelop the sad expression in his pupil's eyes. "Never indeed. Now go on, vanquish the source of sadness in the world, vanquish it and make not only me but those who suffered by his hands happy. You like that, don't you? Making people happy? If you kill him, a lot of people in the church will be happy. Even your friend, that young nun, may be happy as well." The boy was persuaded by those words alone. The boy slowly raised the knife in his hands and turned to face his former caretaker before lowering the knife without hesitation. His blue eyes took in the bound pastor's expression of utter horror. He did this repeatedly, raising and lowering the knife until the man who was restrained in the chair was no longer struggling and yelling in muffled agony while he ignored the odd and agonizing feeling in his chest. A few hours later, the boy was discovered standing alone in front of a garden full of blue roses, beautiful, unnatural roses that he found visually appealing. He was so enthralled with the flowers' beauty that he overlooked his close friend's arrival as well as the ominous clouds hanging over the sky. "Good afternoon, Naruto," the girl exclaimed as she ran to meet her friend, waving her hand wildly. Usually, he would reply with a warm greeting of his own after she called out and greeted her friend. For some reason, the boy didn't answer her greeting that day, but it has been that way ever since they first met and became friends. Asia asked, "Naruto? with a worried expression on her face as she gave her fellow blonde a quick tap on the shoulder to finally get his attention. The boy's eyes widened a little in surprise, then returned to their normally unimpressed shapes. Asia? When did you get here? I got here a few seconds ago. I'm sorry if I didn't greet you properly, I was a bit distracted. Are you okay? Did anything happen? The boy hesitated, then made a hasty attempt to dismiss the girl's worries. It's nothing important. Moo. She looked down at the ground, puffed her cheeks, and kicked the floor with her hands crossed on her back. If something's bothering you, you can tell it to me, that's what friends are for, right? The boy inhaled deeply and said, I guess so. He and his first friend shared nearly everything, so as far as he was aware, there were no secrets between them. Today He twisted his words to form a sort of half-truth because he knew that telling her that he killed someone might make her unhappy, and he didn't like seeing her unhappy. The nun put her hand to her mouth and gasped. That's sad, she said, hurriedly singing the cross and closing her eyes to pray for the deceased, even though she had no idea who they were. What a sweet girl she was. The boy's gaze returned to the blue roses as the girl prayed for the life he had stolen, observing them intently as they swayed in the little breeze that blew by. There was a pause, and then the blonde nun asked one question. Did you know the person who passed away? Yes, you could say that I knew him well. You see, he took care of me when I was younger, taught me how to read, how to write. He was kinda like a father to me before I met Master Garul. Then are you be sad that he died? Sad? The young nun put a hand on her friend's shoulder and said, people feel sad when they see others, especially when it's people that they know or are close to them that die. Naruto, are you sad? The boy put his hand on his chest, where his heart should be, and said, I'm not really sure. I don't feel bad, but I don't feel good either. I feel neutral. Yes, neutral would be the perfect word for it, but despite this feeling I can also feel something painfully tugging in my chest, he said, turning back to the girl who was staring at him with worried eyes. Do you like being sad? Her golden locks thrashed in the wind as she shook her head. I don't like being sad. If possible, I want to be happy as much as possible. So then is being sad bad? Not really. It's okay to be sad. Asia, what do you do when you're sad? When I'm really sad I kinda cry. I cry and cry until the tears stop, until the pain in my chest is gone, until the sad feeling is gone. I see. The boy turned away from his friend to gaze at the blue roses that had been planted in the garden. Should I cry then? Are you feeling sad? Looking at his friend, he said, my chest hurts a bit when I think of the person who died. It hurts so much. His blue eyes met her green ones. I think so. I think I'm sad. As soon as he finished speaking, the boy was swept up into Asia's embrace. He was much larger than her, so it was a warm, if slightly awkward, hug. Then it's okay to cry. The boy's face was marred by a hollow expression as he gazed up at the sky. He put his hands around the girl's and gave her his own embrace, saying, to cry, huh? The boy saw the first drops of rain fall from the sky as he looked up, followed by bursts of light from the darkened sky. He couldn't, so he didn't cry. For his immature mind, the idea of sadness was still too alien. Therefore, rather than weeping and yelling at the sky, the boy chose to gaze at the cloudy black sky in a hollow way while embracing his close friend, accepting the gesture as her attempt to lift his spirits. He was forced to blink briefly as two large drops fell into each of his bright blue eyes, cascading down the outside of them. The droplets gradually descended until they left a trail down the side of his face, leaving his cheeks marred, and then they hit the ground. He appeared to be sobbing in the rain. Kyoke no Ken. Play the Ost for Jigoku Shouju. Ake ni Somaru Crimson blood pools. Blood was all over the place, and the crimson essence of life was smeared on every nook and cranny of the drab gray walls of this hallway. The severed or burned remains of what could hardly be identified as human heads, arms, legs, and organs were scattered across the floor. To describe the scene as nauseating would be a gross understatement. The pawn couldn't help but feel a strong, ominous feeling of dread well up in the pit of his stomach as Issei Hyodo and his allies ran along this path. This was 100 times worse than what he witnessed during one of his failed contracts, when that crazy exorcist Freed attacked and killed his client. The amount of gore and slaughter his group saw when they entered the church was more or less a realistic representation of what would have likely occurred inside a slaughterhouse, so this was on a whole new level. A great deal of death, gore, and blood. He wanted to stop running, walk to the side of a room or perhaps a spot inside the church without blood, and throw up his lunch, dinner, and most likely even breakfast because it was so awful he was not able to endure it. He didn't feel particularly relieved that Asia was safe because he didn't know who killed these men or who killed the fallen angels outside. They could have attacked Asia too. He hasn't been a devil for very long, but he knew that the exorcist who did this was undoubtedly strong, possibly much stronger than Freed, because suddenly his throat felt dry, quickly replacing the urge to throw up. However, it was unclear if the exorcist had the same mindset as Freed. He shuddered in fear at the mere thought there was a possibility that their group was headed for disaster if this man were as ruthless and insane as Freed. He glanced at his fellow devils, Kenneo and Kiba, who appeared to be quite composed in spite of the blood and gore, since such a view couldn't even cause a flinch or slight pallor of the skin. He began to wonder how much violence the two had witnessed. As Issei ran through the hall, his every step splattering blood, he asked, "Do you guys think we're going to have to fight whoever did this?" With his ever-present, sparkling Bishonen smile, Yuto Kiba responded, "Don't worry, Issei-kun. If anything happens, I will protect you." Dang's eerie smile only conveyed the wrong messages, but for some reason, the ominous feeling that washed over him at that precise moment blocked out his normal creepiness. Kenneo responded with her typical icy indifference, "We will beat him." Issei couldn't help but feel a little more confident in their endeavor. Even though there weren't any heartfelt speeches after all, his fellow devils were far more powerful than he was, and they easily defeated the stray devil, demonstrating that they were at least as skilled fighters as he was. Surely, when the chips were down, none of the three would have any trouble defeating a human exorcist? After all, he was only a human. Suddenly, there was a strong sense of dread in the air. As if to respond to his question, it seemed as though an overwhelming sensation filled the entire area, one that could only be described as intense and filled with sheer fear. A fear that was instinctive and primal and told him to flee, perhaps because of the tremendous amount of holiness, divinity, and light that this presence radiated, something he had never experienced before. Seeking an explanation, he glanced at Kiba and Kenneo. While Kiba had wide eyes and was staring blankly in the direction from which the feeling was coming, Kenneo remained impassive, but her body was tense, suggesting that even she was unnerved by the sensation. It seemed as though he was remembering or experiencing something that he was already familiar with. The two senior devils ran toward a nearby staircase that led to the basement. Rather than bothering to respond to him, it didn't take much to figure out that the exorcist was wherever that feeling originated, though it was unclear if he was with Asia. The young devil ran as fast as he could and as far as he could, and to be honest, he had never run this far in his life. This was despite the lingering sense of dread that was still in his system. He dashed up a flight of stairs. He tripped over a heap of corpses. He came upon a puddle of blood. He ran until he came to a blood-stained door that was slightly open. Surprisingly, the underground chapel appeared to be as large as the main cathedral above. He ran until he reached the two other devils entering the room and found himself in a rather large chapel lit by small lamps with several wooden benches. Then he halted his run, halting between Kiba and Kenneo. As he took in the scene, the color swiftly faded from his face. The crucified Son of God was shown on an altar. The exorcist he saw outside was standing in front of the altar, an exorcist wearing clothes that had once been white but were now red from blood. Even so, his focus was on the person the exorcist was staring at. The same person with the golden blonde hair, the same nun attire, the same calm and gentle demeanor, and slightly paler skin. Asia was without a doubt the person he was staring at. He was staring at the nun with whom he had become friends, who lay on the ground with a pool of red surrounding her. She had a stab wound through her heart on her chest. Her own blood was all around her. Asia was dead and gone. Issei Hyodo entered the deepest parts of the deserted church and was both greeted and startled by that sight. It was the very sight that rocked his whole being. No one moved for a brief moment, as though to create a sense of calm in the midst of a potentially destructive and chaotic storm. It seemed as though the exorcist didn't even notice or care about their presence because he was completely focused on Asia and his blue eyes never left her body. Standing next to Issei, Kiba's eyes were calculating as he looked at the exorcist, more especially, the sword that was resting on the person's back. As the knight came to the conclusion that he wanted the exorcist dead for owning the sword, his mind was already racing and working non-stop. An authentic holy sword. Kenneo, on the other hand, gave Issei a rare, anxious look before turning from the young devil to the exorcist, then to the nun, and finally back to Issei. She wasn't a heartless bastard. Even though she wasn't one to typically display emotion, she actually sympathized with Isa's situation. But the brown-haired teenager's gaze remained fixed on Asia's body. His light brown eyes reflected a variety of emotions, including horror, grief, agony, pain, hatred, and finally rage. Anger that was aimed not only at him but also at the exorcist who was standing in front of her quiet, dead body. As was to be expected, Is was the first person in the spacious chapel to break out of his pensive silence. The user of the sacred gear rushed straight at the exorcist who had just murdered his friend with his left arm cocked back like a gun hammer. Issei roared, "Asia quadruple A," as he charged at the priest with the bespectacles. Over the brown-haired boy's arm, a gauntlet materialized in a burst of dazzling red light. He yelled, "Boost," and then, as though pulling a trigger on a gun, he threw his red armor-clad fist in the direction of the exorcist. The initial blow delivered prior to Chaos Kyoke no Ken. With his blue eyes fixed on Asia's fallen form, Naruto's gaze never left the continent. One might assume that the lovely nun was simply sleeping, a quiet, peaceful, and serene sleep, if it weren't for the blood encircling her body. His right hand moved over his heart and toward the top of his chest. Without him even realizing it, he sensed a dull pain coming from it, more like something that existed outside of muscles and cells than something that was primarily physical. Once again, regret was showing its ugly head that was evident from the pain, but what's done is done. No more room for regrets is supposed to exist, but why was the dull pain over his chest still there? Maybe it was because he didn't say sorry for what she had done. That might have been it. He regretted not being able to apologize to her before killing her. Play Kishu in Oda Nobuna no Yabu. His senses abruptly triggered, warning him of an approaching hostile presence, just as he opened his mouth to utter a series of apologetic words. When the exorcist turned to face the newcomer, his body was already responding instinctively, preparing to pull a blade from under his sleeves so he could strike back at his potential assailant. When the exorcist saw his assailant, the brown-haired boy with Asia, his blue eyes grew wide. The devil who brought her joy. As he hesitated to hit the devil, the blonde whispered, "You're," and the teen's punch landed cleanly on his face, a boosted punch powerful enough to send him flying into a wall nearby. However, the exorcist twisted his body in midair so that his feet met the wall before his back crashed and left a man-sized crater in the wall with only a slight cut on his lip. The exorcist was able to bounce off the wall and land on the floor. The bespectacled exorcist cleaned his now busted lips of the new blood. All he could say was, "The devil boy," before he found himself stepping back a few paces, suddenly defensive as the brown-haired devil launched an attack. As the enraged brown-haired devil charged in with reckless abandon, Naruto slowly twisted his body around to dodge several wild jabs. "It looks like my barrier went down earlier than expected," he whispered to himself. As he kept dancing around Issei's attacks, Naruto declared, "I've already completed my mission." While he carefully sidestepped a number of careless blows from an enraged Issei, he confessed, "I no longer have any business here, so if you were to be kind enough, can you allow me to leave? I really don't want to start any trouble here and I'd rather not fight." "Stop dodging, you asshole." With a flat tone and hardly any emotion in his voice, Naruto said, "I'm not in the mood to fight, and if I do so I might just lose what little self-control I have left and kill everyone in this room, and despite me wanting to and having a living involving kill devils, I would make an exception now and not kill any of you because she won't like that." This only served to enrage the brown-haired boy even more. Kaneko and Kiba observed the battle from the sidelines. It was only now that the latter noticed the exorcist's diluted or dulled foreboding presence, more specifically, the katana that was concealed behind the man in the seal-filled scabbard. It didn't take a genius to realize that the sword in the bespectacled exorcist's hand was unquestionably one of those genuine holy swords, and not just one of those mass-produced ones. Kaneko noticed that Yuto's hair was blocking her view of his eyes, making it impossible to read his emotions. She looked back at Issei and saw that the exorcist was being viciously attacked by the recently reincarnated devil, who was able to easily avoid all of his blows. Despite Issei's attack, the exorcist hasn't yet shown any animosity toward them. However, just in case, the rook prepared for combat by putting on her gloves and turning her attention to their unyielding enemy. The exorcist dodged an uppercut from the user of the sacred gear and remarked, "I already took one thing from her today and I'd prefer not to take another." To not take the reason she wanted to stay in this city, he had to leave. It would be best to do so as soon as possible because trying to fight against what was probably the peerage of the Gremory or Citri families wasn't a very smart move on his part. However, he was forced to fight back and defend himself if the group continued to attack him while he was fleeing. When none of Issei's attacks were successful, he gritted his teeth in frustration. The teenager repeated boost once more before attempting to strike the bespectacled blonde in the face. The exorcist swiftly grabbed his outstretched hand and kicked the sacred gear user in the gut, then struck his chin with an upward palm strike that swiftly knocked the devil to his knees. Perceiving this as a possible escape route, Naruto reached into one of his jacket pockets and took out a portable flash bomb that he could use to try to escape. As a yellow blur quickly charged in his direction, his actions appear to have been misunderstood by the other two devils, who probably thought he was being aggressive when he kicked their ally, or at least one of the two who chose to join the fight. Naruto needed to defend himself or risk dying at the hands of his new assailant's blade, so he didn't have time to draw the flash bomb. Shing, the attractive blonde devil, swung his sword at the exorcist, and the sound of metal slicing through the air reverberated throughout the tiny chapel. Shing, the exorcist, made an equally sharp sound and swiftly withdrew one holy sword from his sleeve, swinging it to deflect the oncoming blow. Clang! The sound of steel on steel reverberated throughout the area as the two blades collided, with tiny sparks appearing in the space between them. He said sourly as he pressed his swords firmly against the devil's, causing more sparks to splatter the cathedral room. Now that was just plain rude, Devil-san. Can't you see I'm trying to leave? I told you guys that don't want to fight, I'm not in the mood to kill heathens. In case the situation worsened, Naruto threatened, but if you persist on your actions then I'd have no choice to retaliate in kind. And it escalated. The devil's body exuded a sense of impending danger as soon as he finished speaking. His sixth sense seemed to be alerting him to an impending treat. The devil swordsman staggered back as the bespectacled blonde, trusting his instincts, thrust his blade forward. He retreated a short distance from the blonde swordsman, doing so just in time to prevent at least a dozen swords from emerging from the ground and impaling the spot where he had been standing only moments before. The blades that would have killed him caused a brief shift in Naruto's icy blue eyes. He quickly evaluated each blade and saw that while they were all distinct in one way or another, they all shared a striking resemblance. The light energy that his mass-produced swords emitted was directly opposed by the energy that they all radiated. As Naruto gazed at his new foe, absorbing his fellow blonde's appearance for the first time, he asked, "Demonic swords?" The devil is a poster boy for the category of pretty boys. With short blonde hair, the devil was most likely his age, and the person wielding the demonic sword was dressed in a school uniform he had seen a few times in the city. However, the exorcist's attention was immediately drawn to the expression on his fellow blonde's face rather than the silver-edged demon sword in the devil's hand or the devil's ability to conjure demonic swords out of thin air. A twisted expression of pure anger, rage, and malice, all focused on him alone, adorned his face. "You?" Naruto blinked in complete bewilderment at the devil's extreme animosity. "Me? Is that sword the one strapped on your back one of the true holy swords in this world?" Since there was nothing particularly wrong with telling the devil that he always carried a real holy blade with him, the exorcist gave a straightforward response. "Well, yeah, why'd you ask?" he asked. 3 freshly made demonic swords that were fired like a bullet, slicing through the air and flying in his direction with the promise of unimaginable pain and violence, were the answer to his brief query. Naturally, Naruto retaliated by waving both of his hands, causing 3 swords to appear in each, for a total of 6. Then, with haste, he hurled all 6 blades, 3 toward the approaching blades and the remaining 3 toward the devil. Clang, clang, clang. As the swords sank into the hard granite ground, there was a loud clash of steel against steel as each blade struck and counteracted with the others, sending sparks flying. Whoosh, whoosh, boosh. 3 sacred blades shot out into the air, curving slightly as they pierced the dark room and came hurtling toward the devil at a bullet-like speed. Yuto raised his demonic sword, a silver blade with black ornate decorations, almost instinctively, and used 2 strokes of his own to parry all 3 blades. He discovered roughly 20 more blades aimed directly at his limbs, all of which were thrown to render him incapacitated and remove him from the fight. His brows furrowed, his eyes widened, then narrowed, and his glare towards the exorcist heated to abnormally high levels. He didn't even witness the exorcist's movements or the blades being thrown. The knight, gritting his teeth in exasperation, had to repeatedly swing his demonic sword to block the hail of holy blades. Naruto chose to press his hand against his jacket pockets to pull out the flash bomb once more while Kiba was occupied with the swords. Unfortunately, the little white-haired devil made his escape useless again when he discovered 2 wooden benches flying in his direction. The exorcist with the bespectacles sighed. With 6 swords drawn, 3 between each knuckle of his 2 hands, he remarked, "This is proving to be troublesome." The bespectacled youth turned to face the rapidly approaching benches and decided to hit the first one, causing it to burst into a heap of splinters. Afterward, he dashed in the direction of the second one and leapt onto the airborne bench, which he used to launch himself at the smaller devil, who had already assumed a combat stance by that point. But as he got closer to the little devil, he noticed a faint jolt of demonic magic. He glanced in the direction of the source for a moment and saw that it was the devil with the brown hair. Boost! With the devil's left arm outstretched and pointed directly at him, a crimson orb sank into the palm of the crimson-red gauntlet, a magical bullet that causes destruction. Dragon shot! As he released the tiny ball of energy, Issei let out a cry. The tiny crimson orb had vanished, replaced by a crimson beam of destruction that exploded outward. If not for the beam's lack of control, Naruto would have most likely been killed or rendered incapacitated by the intense demonic energy. The bespectacled exorcist was able to twist his body in midair to avoid the path that the beam took because of the rather chaotic scattering of the beam's waves. Boom! Unfortunately for him, the granite ceiling above him developed a hole large enough to accommodate 1 person just as Naruto landed on the ground too soon, forcing him to refocus his attack on Issei, whom he now considered to be a greater threat to his escape. Before racing towards a kneeling and panting Issei, he hurled 6 blades at Kenneo, who jumped away to avoid it because he didn't want to test the blade's metal, and 6 more at Yuto, who deflected it with his demonic blade. The exorcist kicked off the ground and launched himself at the user of the sacred gear, channeling chakra to his legs. Smash! As the exorcist's fist struck his abdomen again, the brown-haired devil found himself coughing rather violently. After that, Issei was the target of a barrage of punches and kicks that left his body with excruciating contusions. Issei, who never backs down, cocked his fist back and attempted to counterattack by hurling a haymaker at the young man with the bespectacles. Unfortunately, the exorcist caught Issei's incoming fist, used it to lift his body, and then landed behind him, allowing Issei to land 2 simultaneous chakra-powered body blows that sent the brown-haired devil crashing with a loud thud towards a nearby wall. In order to finally escape, the exorcist then swiftly bent his own knees while channeling chakra towards his legs. Then, with a burst of power, he launched himself off the ground and toward the hole the devil's attack had made in the ceiling. As a holy sword materialized in each hand, Naruto questioned, "You guys really won't let me escape, will you?" He turned his head slightly to the side and noticed that his fellow blonde had leapt from the ground and was coming straight at him while brandishing his sword. The demonic sword user would have already suffered a 95% death blow in this scenario if Naruto hadn't been attempting to avoid summoning the Seitri's or Grammari's wrath by recklessly charging in. The blonde devil left himself vulnerable to at least 5 death blows, all of which involved being impaled by multiple holy swords. He could only imagine the amount of paperwork that would be thrown at him if he were to start a war, but unfortunately, he couldn't afford the risk. Additionally, the church might attempt to excommunicate and kill him for this reason. The bespectacled exorcist chose to focus on the flow of his fellow blonde's blades, identifying the style's weakness, and then using it to his advantage by swinging his blade at it, forcing the enraged devil to halt his charge and switch to defense. Since there was a maelstrom high above the air in the form of a fierce storm of holy and demonic swords clashing and crashing against one another, the knight and the exorcist exchanged at least 10 blows in a split second, and sparks rained down on the chapel below them. The devil was defeated after a fierce battle in which the exorcist managed to get his leg inside Kiba's guard and kick Kiba in the chest, sending the knight flying toward multiple benches and breaking his fall at the expense of his 2 swords. To his annoyance, Naruto's brief encounter with the devil caused him to fall to the ground. However, as his feet struck the granite floor, he launched himself upwards once more in the direction of the ceiling hole, only to be prevented from reaching his escape route again by the devil's unexpected intervention. Another bench was thrown at him this time, and as was to be expected, he cut it in 2, causing it to burst into wood splinters and chunks. Once more he did not anticipate, however, that the small girl, with whom he has not yet engaged in combat, would emerge from behind the wood explosion. "A distraction," murmured Naruto, studying his new foe intently. If he were facing a queen or something, he was somewhat at a disadvantage because he was still in midair, but if she was a pawn or a rook, he had a good chance of easily incapacitating her. He watched as the girl cocked her fist back and then abruptly released it in the form of a powerful punch rather than attacking an extremely powerful blow. However, the punch was slow in spite of its strength. Incredibly slow. It appeared as though she was walking through molasses to his eyes, which were conditioned to follow at speeds comparable to those of elite devils and knights. As his left hand slithered around her approaching fist, he expressed his opinion, saying, "Slow." After that, a number of events occurred in a matter of seconds, making it seem as though time had slowed down. He couldn't possibly overwhelm her, that much was clear, but he could at least deflect the attack by subtly using his lesser strength. In light of this, he reached for the white-haired girl's elbow and tapped it to deflect her blow. He was able to maneuver his body along the length of her arm, causing her attack to miss him by a significant amount. The blonde witch used gravity and a powerful downward push in the shoulder to send the little devil descending slowly. Naruto, intent on using her as a dashboard to give him the final boost he needed to get into that hole and ceiling and out of here, planted his feet on the small of her back as she fell back to the ground, leaping upward toward the hole. He stomped down on Kaneko's back. He was only a few seconds away from passing it, but his senses warned him of the impending danger. Roughly 20 demonic swords flying in the direction of his escape route, and he was forced to give up on the attempt once more. There is absolutely no chance of surviving without being fatally skewered by the demonic swords. He turned to face the direction the blade had come from and discovered that the blonde devil was the one who had attacked. "Did you just copy my attack?" He wasn't sure how he should feel about someone, much less a devil of all people, copying his technique. However, he simply imitated Ciel's and Alexander Sensei's moves. The wielder of the demonic sword chose not to respond, instead conjuring up a number of additional blades out of thin air and hurling them at the exorcist like bullets. Naruto just clicked his tongue while changing his body's trajectory to place his feet on the ceiling. He used more chakra and rolled against the ceiling to prevent a rain of demonic blades from falling on him. After removing the chakra from the soles of his boots, he was able to avoid a few more swords and fall to the ground once more. The young man with the glasses eyes darted around the chapel as he descended. Asia's eternally serene body lay close to the altar, which remained unharmed. The blonde devil, who was always glaring at him, was standing opposite him. He had a cut on his cheek, blood running down the side of his mouth, and beads of sweat on his forehead. The brown-haired devil was standing to the sword user's far left, his legs trembling weakly, his body battered, and he was clearly exhausted but still preparing for battle, as evidenced by the boy's repeated use of the word, boost. That one had a backbone to him, which would have been almost admirable if he weren't a devil. Just a moment, the little one went where? The last person he was searching for, the same person approaching from his blind side, was finally brought to his attention by a sudden change in the atmosphere and a surge of demonic energy. He turned his head slightly and saw that it was the little girl coming toward him, ready to strike with the wooden bench she was holding in her hand as though it were weightless, wielding it like an axe. Smash! She swung it like a bat and smashed it into every part of his body. His body was flung toward the wall where the brown-haired devil stood, causing the bench to split in two on the outside. He continued to appear composed, but on the inside, he was berating himself for making such a rookie error. He avoided looking at any of his rivals, particularly the one who was currently the biggest treat. Before her words were overpowered by an irate yell from the devil Asia had made friends with, he heard the small devil say, "Knock him out." Boost. He turned his icy blue eyes to the voice and saw Issei Hyodo creating another magical bullet in the palm of his gauntlet-clad hand. Huh? He asked. This one appeared somewhat smaller than the previous one. Probably as a result of the devil's injured condition, he could not have avoided the attack without suffering any damage, though, and that was the true issue. He was going straight at the charging boy at the speed of a flying bullet. So there was no way to avoid this one. Since he was unable to avoid it, it was best to fight magic with magic. Dragon Shot. As he released the majority of his energy in the form of a destructive red blast, the devil let out a cry. Despite the fact that it was far weaker than the previous shot, Naruto understood that being struck by it would result in defeat, death, and incapacitation because of the limitations of the human body. Since he saw magic and ninjutsu as a supplement to his fighting skills, Naruto actually didn't enjoy using them all that much. However, it is still safe to assume that he is skilled in a variety of arcane arts when the need arises. Additionally, he was a master of one element, the same element that the Seraph Uriel used. Indeed, Naruto Uzumaki was a very skilled firefighter, a talent that he reportedly inherited from his father. An appropriate component for a person who brought death and destruction to pagan people. The sage's descendant shifted his body so that his face was pointed at Issei as he flew in that direction. Then his hands moved, forming a clasp with his thumbs up straight and pointing to his mouth and index finger. The blonde inhaled deeply and felt heat kneading inside his body, which quickly intensified and begged to be released. He obeyed with pleasure with his usual flat tone. The exorcist said, "Shinka. Gokakyu, Sacred Flame. Great Fireball," before opening his mouth and letting out a huge blue orb of roaring, fierce sacred flames that flew in the direction of the beam. An uncontrollably dispersed beam of power against a precisely concentrated ball of sacred blue flames. There was no competition. The red beam was consumed by the sacred blue flames before it proceeded toward the person wearing the sacred gear, who was fortunate enough to roll and duck out of the way of the blue fireball to escape burning. Fortunately, he was completely spared from the fireball that melted through the chapel's walls, leaving a huge hole in its wake. Issei, however, was not immune to Naruto, who, after stopping, charged at the still recovering Issei and successfully delivered a chakra kick along Issei's chest. The blow was powerful enough to send Issei flying out of the battlefield and into another area of the subterranean layers of the deserted church, crashing through the chapel wall directly next to the one formed by the blue fireball. As he flipped in midair and hit the ground, Naruto said, "That's one down. At least the person wearing the sacred gear won't be dead," even though his body would likely hurt for some time. Even though he felt a sense of accomplishment for kicking the devil that Asia had made friends with, he ignored the thought because he wasn't a vindictive or jealous person. Not at all. Play the dance of Curse Ost for Escaflowne. When Naruto's senses detected an impending attack, he let out a frustrated sigh. He ducked to avoid being decapitated by a demonic sword and then rolled away from his previous position to avoid being crushed to pieces by a surprisingly powerful axe kick from the small girl that left a small crater on the floor. "I would doubt beating your companion would make you guys back off," he said. His suspicions that the girl was a rook were soon reduced as a result. "But it seems that I have mistaken. That option was moot because they would undoubtedly prevent him from ever using his flash grenade, the teleportation technique, which was based on biblical texts and was similar to Alexander Sensei's earlier use, required him to be idle for a short while, something he was certain the devils wouldn't grant him since it's the simplest option. He could always kill them all. He could burn his fellow blonde alive in a sea of blue flames, he could cut off the brown-haired boy's hand and slice off his head, and he could repeatedly impale the small girl with his hot holy blade until she screamed. That last one didn't sound quite right for some reason. It seemed like he had committed a crime simply by thinking about it or bringing it up. He let out a sigh after all. He took a lot of lives that day. Despite my job and my vow to annihilate all heathens from the face of this world, I really don't want to kill any of you at the moment. Naruto produced 2 swords, which he promptly used to block and parry a number of blows from the furious knight, who was still moving at breakneck speed despite his wounds. The slower but more powerful Rook approached the exorcist after a brief altercation in which he pushed the swordsman back. The girl was forced to halt her charge and leap aside to avoid being impaled by the holy swords after he threw no fewer than 6 blades at her with a flick of his wrist. I've already knocked one of you down and I hoped that would distract you 2 enough to allow me to escape, but it seems that it only made you 2 even more mad. He swiftly blocked a number of Kiba's blows before choosing to move a short distance away from the devil, whom he shoved back following the altercation. That said, I see that as of now retreat is not an option. You devils have left me no choice, emanated from the mild-mannered exorcist, whose face remained expressionless but which slowly revealed a hint of underlying savagery. I will not kill anyone, but I will be forced to incapacitate you 2 before I leave. Naruto changed his fighting style from one that was more defensive to one that was more offensive. With a simple push of a button, the impact was instantaneous, unrestrained. He charged at Kenneo, his holy swords encased in a wreath of blue flame. Whoosh! He easily dodged the girl's punch because, in spite of her strength, she lacked the speed needed to land the blows. Whoosh whoosh, a classic boxing move, a 1-2 jib. If it landed, it would have been devastating, but sadly, it was too slow, too sluggish for his eyes and body, which could follow the moves of elite devils. Swish swish! Naruto maneuvered inside her defenses and used her own speed, or lack thereof, to his advantage, slicing her chest with his blade twice in an X pattern. Other than the clothing damage, which left her school uniform and the bra underneath it in charred ruins, she only suffered minor injuries from his attack because of her Rook defense and Kiba's last-minute withdrawal. Yuto yelled, "He's mine!" and drew Kenneo away as they briefly fled from the bespectacled exorcist, their bodies making their way to the wall that had been destroyed by the fireball. "Let me help, senpai." The knight swung his sword, which had turned black, signifying the activation of Holy Eraser, the demonic sword that devours holy essence, and used the sword's power to destroy 4 blades of light that had been thrown at them during their conversation. "You're too slow to keep up with him, let me take care of this." His gaze never leaving the exorcist, he added definitively, "You go check on Issei." It didn't take a genius to figure out that Kenneo was hesitant to follow Knight's instructions, even though she responded with her typically flat voice, "Hi senpai." Beyond the hole in the wall, Kenneo turned to face the heap of debris where a bleeding, bruised, and battered Issei sat before running to help the recently reincarnated devil. She told her senpai, "Don't lose." As his body blurred with the use of his knight's speed, the knight nodded at her before holding his black sword in one hand, ready to strike Naruto at any time. "I've been waiting for this," he said. The exorcist blurred his body from existence as he ran towards the devil in retaliation. As the 2 fighters found themselves engaged in a violent, high-speed, death-defying melee, the chapel was filled with flashes of light and darkness and the sound of clashing steel. Even though Kiba was becoming more and more angry and hateful because his opponent was wielding a real holy sword, he was still taken aback by the human's incredible skill and ability. It was well known that devils were superior to humans in all respects, including strength, speed, magical reserves, and natural abilities, but for some reason, the human seemed to be stronger, faster, and more proficient than him in every facet of combat. Regardless of what he did, this fact makes him extremely irritated. Swish! Yuto effortlessly smashed through 2 of the exorcist's burning swords with a single swing of his blazing black blade. He attempted to take advantage of this and advance his attack on his now disarmed adversary. Swish! With the intention of cutting through his opponent's chest and splitting him in 2, the knight swung his sword horizontally, but much to his surprise, another pair of holy swords held XYs across the bespectacled blonde's chest instead of his demonic sword meeting flesh. Clang! A few sparks flew between them as the sounds of their swords colliding reverberated. While he was in the middle of slamming his swords into Kiba's, Naruto arched a languid brow. He asked naively, "What were you waiting for? Have you been waiting for me to get serious and kick your ass?" Kiba didn't bring it because, as evidenced by the devil's blade pushing harder, those words apparently infuriated the devil. Make him more irate to make him a poorer swordsman. As anticipated, Kiba overextended himself and leaned in towards the exorcist's body as a result of Naruto losing his grip on his blade, allowing the devil to overwhelm and destroy his swords. Naruto stepped aside quickly and then reached out to the devil with his elbow as expected. The elbow met the devil's immaculate Bishonen face in a rather unpleasant way. As 3 blades materialized between each of his knuckles in both hands, Naruto questioned, "Or were you waiting for me to knock out the kid with the gauntlet, almost incapacitate the girl, and being so close in beating you, so I can finally escape before your leader comes in and everything blows up in my face?" As Kiba recovered from the elbow strike, the exorcist stepped towards him and swung both of his hands in an attempt to remove him. Clang Yuto raised the black demonic blade to defend himself, and all 6 blades met its length. He would have probably discovered 6 more wounds from those holy swords if it weren't for his superior speed and reflexes as a knight. In order to escape the devil, Naruto channeled chakra to his legs before launching himself backwards in a crazy reverse dash. This gave him enough distance to throw the 6 blades. 2 of them grazed the devil across his shoulders, causing the skin to be lacerated by the holy blades that poisoned the damned. The other 4 were easily blocked. The devil was forced to abandon his planned attack and drop to one knee as blood spurted from his shoulders. "Tell me again, were you waiting for this?" In response, a visibly irritated and enraged Yuto merely gritted his teeth. He was furious that the exorcist had not even wielded the true holy sword, which he hated, that he was being ejected, and that his opponent appeared so disinterested and uninterested during their duel. They didn't even seem to think he was a threat with his sword firmly grasped in both hands. Kiba rose slowly, his legs trembling a little from fatigue. Disregarding his injuries before he disappeared in a sudden rush of speed, he leaned slightly down, preparing to attack the exorcist. The devil was undoubtedly fast, at least as fast as a mid-class devil. Albeit a little slower than himself, they would undoubtedly find it more difficult to deal with the demonic sword user if it were any other exorcist. However, he was an executioner, one of the few people permitted to hunt down and murder powerful devils, rather than just another exorcist. As a swordsman, Kiba would have noticed right away that his opponent's stance was strange if he hadn't been so consumed by his anger at facing an exorcist who might have had a true holy sword. He would have observed that the exorcist's guard had multiple deadly gaps that were begging to be attacked, but they were left unguarded. It was such a reckless and downright suicidal, yet incredibly effective fighting style, that Naruto deliberately opened up his guard, inviting his opponents to attack those spots so he could better predict the flow of his attacks. Unfortunately, Kiba failed to notice that, so he used the opportunity to concentrate his attacks on the gaps in his opponent's defense for a few seconds in the hopes of killing the murderous exorcist. The bespectacled youth easily dodged, blocked, and parried his angry attacks. Every unsuccessful attack was retaliated with a vicious counterattack that resulted in some degree of injury throughout the knight's body. This counterattack could take the form of a punch, a kick, or a stroke of the holy sword. The fire was only fueled by that, as his black blade created a misty black miasma that encircled the 2 holy swords he was currently facing. Kiba exclaimed, "Holy eraser. Stop using those cheap second-hand holy swords, they're useless against my demonic swords." He glared at the sword strapped behind the blonde, his attacks becoming even more vicious than before, forcing the exorcist to go on the defensive. A second after contact, both of his enemy's blades were destroyed. He bellowed, "Use it, use that holy sword so I can destroy it," as he lunged toward Naruto, who was now quiet. The blades that had been destroyed were once again replaced by 2. Naruto asked, "Have we met before?" as he easily deflected the attack, his eyes and mind already planning a quick counterattack. Kiba appeared to be momentarily roused from his rage-induced stupor by the unexpected question posed by his fellow blonde. As he continued to clash blades with his fellow blonde, he responded, "No." The bespectacled executor muttered, "Why do you look familiar?" as he took Kiba's slashes blow by blow. He didn't care that his sword was destroying each of his own blades because he had thousands of them for use, and it wouldn't hurt to lose a few hundred. Even though Naruto and Kiba were engaged in combat, his mind was racing, trying to remember anything about a person with the ability to make demonic swords. His old rival and friend Siegfried was the first person that sprang to mind, but he later remembered that the man had twice critical for a sacred piece of equipment rather than one that produced demonic swords. Produced the swords? Naruto's brows languidly raised as he realized, a sacred gear that creates demonic swords, the sacred gear sword birth. You're that one kid from that holy sword project, the one that got away from the massacre. Kiba glared more intensely at the exorcist, and his eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" he asked, stepping back from the altercation a few paces to give the exorcist a chance to speak and give himself a little time to gather himself. He tapped his head to confirm what he had said. "Well, I'm fairly well informed about the happenings in the church. After all, information is power, another weapon we can use in battle." That, and I knew of the Holy Sword Project. After all, it was aimed to create artificial holy sword users based on Valpyr Galilee's dream of wielding the Excalibur, but to accomplish his dream, he needed something, a blueprint if you say so. Yuto Kiba was by no means a simpleton. Using only the cryptic words that the exorcist had thrown at him, he began to piece together the details in his mind until he reached a clear conclusion. His eyes widened as he first gazed into space, as though he were staring at the abyss itself, before turning to face his opponent in disbelief. As though realizing that the devil had finally made the connection, Naruto exclaimed, "Oh, so you finally get it, huh? Yes, Devil-san. The blueprint for artificial holy sword users were based on me. A true holy sword wielder. They tried to create holy sword users based on me and my bond with my sword. You can say that I'm what they were trying to achieve, copy, and emulate Devil-san." As the best words were spoken, Kiba saw the exorcist's mouth move slowly. "I was part of the reason for the creation of that project." As Yuto Kiba processed the news, he heard something snap inside of him, followed by the sound of something breaking in his head. Yuto Kiba saw only red, blood red, rage-filled red, murderous red. Not even a second later, all he wanted was to witness the source of all the suffering that he and his friends endured being transformed into a fine red paste on the hard, cold granite floor. His goal was to murder the exorcist. The demonic user let out a vile, hateful growl that actually caused his fellow devils, Kenneo and Issei, to flinch and tremble in terror when they heard it coming from beyond the wall's opening. The normally kind knight's body emitted waves of an unimaginable amount of rage and malice. "You're dead." The knight's scream, filled with malice, reverberated throughout the church and the underground chapel. He ran towards the exorcist, ready to lash out at the person responsible for his traumatic past, while holding his demonic sword by the side with both hands. With all the force he could muster, he raised his sword and swung it down. As Naruto summoned his own two lightsabers from his sleeves and swung them both in Kiba's direction, his blades colliding with the demonic sword in a loud metallic clang, he declared, "Chance of victory 95%. The moment you let your emotions get the better of you is also the moment of your defeat." It was easy to destroy the two holy blades that were obstructing the holy eraser. The anger-fueled anti-holy weapon cut through them like butter, so there was no denying that. But as soon as those swords broke, Naruto let go of them and began to spin around a little while remaining stationary and holding his right hand out to his side. He then began to repeat the rite of passage technique that was taught to all chakra adepts, including Uzumaki. That's the same method he picked up from some scrolls after being exiled. Turn around, get stronger, maintain stability, as a blue spiraling sphere of power formed in the palm of his outstretched hand. Those 3 steps flashed through his mind. The exorcist trusted the orb to face the approaching black blade and finished his spin without hesitation. Rasengan, spiraling sphere. After a few seconds of contact with the sphere, the holy eraser broke, but the orb itself remained alive and continued to spin wildly as it fell onto the devil's chest. The blonde's flames threw Yuto to a nearby wall, across from the one that had been destroyed earlier. The devil coughed up blood, and the wall behind him cracked with a loud crash, creating a tiny crater. Several holy swords pinned the knight to the wall limb for limb before he could even heal and push himself away from the wall or even determine the full extent of his injuries. Before the knight passed out from the agony of the strange sphere that destroyed his sword and nearly caused his chest to collapse along with the swords protruding from his body, what had been a cry of rage gave way to one of pain, which was frighteningly similar to a gasped death. Disappointed with the fight's result, Naruto shook his head and said, "Rage can only bring you so far." Even though he made sure none of his blows were fatal, he was certain that they still hurt a lot. "That's why I don't need to use Kusanagi against you. Using it would just be plain overkill, and I wouldn't want that. Not when your king is most likely connected to either the Lucifer or the Leviathan of the underworld. Don't want to start an international incident that may break the ceasefire and all." The exorcist's blue eyes welcomed the sight of the small devil and the battered brown-haired devil going through the hole in the wall as he turned his head in that direction. "So would you two allow me to leave, or would you like to suffer the same fate as the sword user?" Eyes screamed, "Kiba!" as he put a hand on the shattered wall to keep himself from falling to the ground from his wounds. As the exorcist attempted to push himself off the wall, the brown-haired devil grunted in agony, his eyes glaring at him, the fire in his eyes still burning brightly, ready for another fight. Play the Battle of Brs Ost for Black Rock Shooter. Issei was stopped from moving by an outstretched arm. "Stand back," Kenneo said in a monotone, giving Issei a look that the male devil could easily interpret as her handling the fight. He wanted to respond in some way, but her expression told him to stop talking. In a southpaw boxing stance, Kenneo approached the exorcist with both gloved hands balled into fists, her feet wide apart, both arms raised, her right hand close to her body, and her left arm extending slightly toward Naruto. With an exasperated sigh, Naruto placed his left hand on the bridge of his glasses and pushed it up slightly to put it back in a more comfortable position after it had moved slightly downward during his battle with his fellow blonde. I see, for the last time, are you sure about this? She threw a left jab that smashed through the air because the bespectacled blonde could easily avoid it by swaying his body away from the fist's path with all the strength she could muster. The little devil kicked off the ground, shattering the footing beneath her as she moved forward. "Hi," she said in a straightforward, flat monotone as she continued to throw a few more jabs while trying to gauge her opponent's posture and movements. Her discovery resembled the one Kiba saw. His defense was full of flaws. They were ridiculously big and begging to be taken advantage of. Kenneo, who is more composed, pays closer attention than Kiba. Are the gaps a ruse? Did she intentionally bat her? Those were the ideas that whirled through her head. Choosing to take a chance, she searched for a smaller, less obvious gap in the exorcist's defense. She nearly struck her opponent with a swift right jab. Nearly was the crucial word, since he was able to react and escape just before her fist was about to collide with his body. Since every jab she sent through his defenses was easily dodged and avoided, sometimes even at the last second as if to deliberately mock her inability to land a decent hit, Kenneo could admit that he was fast, slightly faster than the Kiba. Kenneo clicked her tongue inwardly and changed tactics, trying to confuse the exorcist by incorporating kicks into the mix. It failed to sell. He simply ducked under every kick and punch, but this time he delivered his own, powerful, quick blows that were directed at her heart, neck, and chest, none of which really worked because she could easily withstand those blows due to her innate defense as a rook. Naruto cautiously dodged a kick meant for his right leg and a hook meant for his face, saying, "We seem to have a stalemate here." Like he did with the blonde swordsman. He tried to agitate the emotionless girl by asking, "Why are we fighting again?" in a tone as bored as Kaneko's. When Kenneo finally came up with a plan that was insane enough to work, she said, "You hurt them." She raised her left leg and then, using all of her strength, stomped it down, sending pieces of earth flying everywhere and exploding the granite flooring underneath. Kenneo took a quick step forward, carefully swaying her body around the flying debris, and managed to get inside the blonde's guard. This allowed her to deliver a right-handed uppercut that, had he not taken a step back, would have nearly nailed the blonde in the chin. "So I'll hurt you back." However, the exorcist was able to slide back a few feet from her due to the sheer force of the blow, landing him close to the center of the underground chapel. As he brushed the tiny debris off his soiled vestments, Naruto whistled. "That was close." A set of 3 blades materialized between his hands' knuckles as he said, "I guess there is no avoiding it then." His icy blue eyes met the devil's emotionless golden orbs as he said, "I've already seen the future." With absolute confidence, he said, "You will lose in 5 moves. Kick his ass." Issei yelled from the side, "Like hell, Kenneo-chan will lose." However, both Kenneo and Naruto were able to ignore and muffle his voice. The former was only aware of his presence in case he chose to join the fight, and he didn't really care what he had to say. The latter was too preoccupied with considering her next move and was making every effort to remain unaffected by her opponent's declaration of victory. Although it wasn't particularly well known, Kenneo was one of her peers' more perceptive members, and it was thanks to her skill at this that she noticed the exorcist's forehead was starting to perspire. Before anyone could say, "Issei is a pervert," Stamina had the solution to her problems. It was as easy as that. Her opponent is still human regardless of his strength, speed, or magical prowess. Humans generally experience fatigue more quickly than devils at some point because their bodies still have limitations, unlike those of devils, angels, fallen angels, or yokai, who do not. Since she is a rook, the branch of the peerage with the greatest physical prowess and stamina, she only needed to outlast him in battle to prove her strategy would succeed. Kenneo congratulated herself inwardly before charging at her opponent with the intention of wearing him out by prolonging the match. She began with a mix of punches and kicks, aiming both low and high while being cautious not to approach the holy blades. Naruto paid close attention to each punch and kick, watching how the attacks progressed before letting his sharp reflexes take over and avoiding each blow. The sage's descendant said, "I already know that you both are strong," as he dodged a particularly powerful haymaker whose wind would have carried him away if he hadn't used chakra to hold himself in place. He threw the 6 at Kenneo, watching in silence as she ducked, swayed, and even rolled to her side to avoid the holy blades. That was one action. Another set of 6 blades materialized in his hands. He threw half of them straight at the devil and the other 3 more forcefully, which caused them to miss the girl entirely and land somewhere behind her. That was 2 moves. She attempted to move quickly in his direction, determined to keep up her barrage of fists and kicks, but Kenneo was forced to stop thinking when the exorcist opened his mouth and let out a recognizable blue ball of flames. As the full force of the attack pushed her back, The rook raised her hands and crossed them against her body, causing her feet to skid violently on the ground. Although it took her some time, she was able to break the spell thanks to her resilience, leaving her largely unharmed except for the fact that she was left nearly nude and that soothe covered her normally pale skin. 3 moves, that is, and durable. Naruto nodded to himself as he observed her gasping for air as she stood surrounded by multiple holy swords he had previously thrown as his hand reached for the true holy sword strapped behind him. The impassive girl's eyes widened slightly before narrowing at him as her body tensed to unprecedented levels. This is slightly troublesome since you can probably take anything I can normally dish out. I guess this leaves me with no choice. Psyche. Instead of reaching for the sword, he swiftly moved his hand from his side to his front, clapping with his other hand until they moved his left thumb on top, forming what many would refer to as a ram seal. Kekai no Jutsu. Kyuken Kekai. Barrier technique. 9 sword barrier. When he said those words, Kenneo was surrounded by 3 swords that glowed eerily. Each blade projected a wall of blue, creating a triangle barrier that trapped the devil inside. 3 more swords began to shine brightly outside the barrier until another triangle-shaped blue barrier formed. This one pointing in the opposite direction of the first. The final 3 of the 9 swords were protruding beyond the second barrier as in the previous 2 instances. The swords glowed brilliantly before a new barrier was created, this time using the opposite potion as the final one to create a 3-layered triangular barrier. 4 moves, that is as any human, devil, or other person who finds themselves unexpectedly confined would do. Kenneo punched the walls of the first barrier. She was fortunate, in retrospect, that Naruto refrained from using the barrier that would have burned her with holy flames. She was able to kick, tackle, and punch the first barrier. As a result, to her secret delight, Kenneo discovered that her attacks were actually making her new prison a little more bearable. Her fate was unfortunately sealed by the exorcist's subsequent remarks. He switched between a tiger hand seal and a ram seal. Shinka. Sanso Sho, Sacred Flame, Hypoxia. The entire sealed area was suddenly engulfed in a sea of blue flames as a massive pillar of flame erupted from between each barrier. She was ultimately destroyed by the tiny cracks in the innermost barrier, which let a few flames in and consumed the meager amount of oxygen in her prison. The oxygen content of the first barrier fell to almost nothing in a matter of seconds, prompting Kenneo to halt her attack and put her hands around her neck as she struggled for breath. However, none arrived, and she soon found herself tumbling to the ground with her thoughts already shifting into the unconscious. Checkmate. 5 moves. As soon as the devil fell to the ground, the exorcist let go of the seal, which allowed the barrier and the flames holding the unconscious devil to fall. This gave her body enough space to unconsciously take in more oxygen. She came dangerously close to death, but at least she survived. After all, she was a devil, so she wouldn't be severely harmed by a few seconds without oxygen. The team decided to charge at the blonde killer again, even though his body and reserves were essentially non-existent at that point. Kenneo. The young boosted gear user glared at the exorcist. He tried to deliver a sucker punch to the blonde's neck with his fist out in front of him, but the exorcist easily stepped aside, tripped him, grabbed his unsteady self, and threw him away in the direction of the altar close to the body of fallen Asia. Naruto let out a sigh of frustration and mild fatigue. He would have commended Kenneo for being so close to the truth if he had known what she was thinking. He had to get this done quickly because he was growing weary. Are you really going to attack me? Despite his physical discomfort and lack of endurance, Issei pushed himself off the ground and persisted. He hurried over to the exorcist, who was by that point just idly staring at him while he threw his fists in the air. As the exorcist danced around his attacks, he questioned, "Why? Huh?" The intensity of his punches increased with each one, as though to highlight his intense dislike of the exorcist's behavior. "Why did you kill her? She was so nice, so innocent. She only wanted to have friends and live a quiet and normal happy life. Why did you have to kill her? Why?" he asked. "Because it was my mission," Naruto answered, keeping his tone emotionally neutral. His right hand moved, deflecting a blow from the crimson-colored gauntlet that managed to push him back slightly. The happiness of many comes before the happiness of the few. With her death, the church's followers who demanded for her death would finally achieve happiness. Would you really be so selfish as to not grant them their happiness for the sake of one life? He said. For the sake of the life of a traitor who healed the enemy of the church, who healed a devil. Mission? You killed her over something as stupid as that? Before answering, Naruto hesitated for a brief moment as he let go of the devil's fist. He acknowledged, "Yes, I killed her for the sake of my mission." He stepped back a few paces, his body swaying from side to side as he dodged another round of punches from the boy with the brown hair. Issei Hyodo halted his attack and stepped back from the exorcist, his brown bangs casting a shadow over his eyes as his body was battered, bruised, And pushed to the limit of fatigue, the teenager failed to protect Asia, was too late, couldn't forgive himself, and didn't arrive quickly enough, he muttered, his thirst for power gradually growing. Give her back. Naruto observed Issei getting up once more after falling for an unknown number of times during the day. But the devil's legs gave out on him before he could stand up completely, and he fell back to the ground. The exorcist saw a fiery will that would not give up, even though the devil had no combat experience and was fighting like an amateur. A fiery will that, to be honest, briefly alarmed Naruto. He was unable to give an explanation, but he felt a deep-seated urge to put out this flame before it grew larger. Put it out before it grows into a massive fire that will scorch the entire planet. Damn it! Issei smashed his balled-up fists against the ground while glancing at it. Why? His eyes began to well up with tears. He continued to pound his fists against the concrete floor, unaware that the devil was staring down at him with a rather melancholy and sympathetic expression on his face, as if the exorcist understood the boy's feelings at that precise moment. Why'd I have to be so weak? Asia, Kaneko, Kiba, you all got hurt because I was too weak. Why couldn't I protect you all? You're all hurt because of me. Issei swore again, but this time the green gem inside his holy armor began to glow. Damn it, what? Power's sacred gear is said to be desire, and that was his desire. To harm the exorcist before him, he needed strength. He wanted to harm him because he had harmed Kiba and Kaneko. He desired strength to harm him for Asia's death. He has already failed to keep everyone safe. Nothing else mattered now. All he wanted to do was harm the exorcist, Booster Dragon. His gauntlet, which covered most of the boy's arm, made a mechanical noise as it transformed into a more ferocious-looking dragon-like version of the sacred gear. Boost! Naruto snapped out of his reverie and raised an eyebrow at the user of the sacred gear when he heard the devil whispering softly, "Dragon Booster." His eyebrows briefly furrowed as his mind hurriedly considered where he had given that order. His eyes widened in realization after a few seconds. One of the 13 Longinus? The Red Dragon Emperor's gauntlet, boosted gear. Boost! Issei Hyodo rose slowly, his past wounds no longer significant. His body was flooded with a newfound strength. It was pleasant. This would allow him to battle the exorcist at last. He can finally kick that guy's ass with this. Boost! Before he kicked off the ground and ran frantically in the direction of the exorcist, he said, "Promotion. Queen." From his gauntlet, he could hear a faint whispering that told him he needed to use a command that could change the outcome of this battle and give him the opportunity to strike the exorcist with devastating force. Explosion. With that command, the power and boosts that had been stored in the sacred gear were released straight into Issei's system, giving him a power that was greater than his usual capabilities and on par with his king's. Give Asia BACKKKKKKKK. As he watched the power increase, Naruto's eyes remained wide before gradually narrowing at the devil. The power he was projecting was greater than that of a low-class devil, not even a middle-class one. Instead, the devil was generating power levels that were on par with those of a high-class devil. The pawn briefly disappeared and then reappeared a few feet away from the blonde, his arm already cocked back in a burst of speed that matched that of the disabled knight. Blow away, you shitty priest. The devil's hand sprang forward like a gunshot, crashing through the air with a loud whoosh as it got closer to the blonde exorcist, poised to inflict an unholy amount of deadly pain and violence on the individual. Even so, it was only a straightforward punch, a straight, that lacked the dexterity and skill of a demonic sword user's slashes or the speed of a fatigued devil's punches. It appeared as though Issei was moving slowly to Naruto Uzumaki. His attack strategy was blatantly obvious, seemingly telegraphed from a mile away. He could cut the boy's arm off, but he wouldn't want to do that because he wouldn't want to kill the devil, because Asia would be upset if he killed her friend Hurt. I have done that already, but I haven't killed anyone. As he took one step in the direction of the incoming fist, Naruto muttered to himself, "Enough of this." He then spun around to face Issei's body, completely dodging the empowered punch in his right hand. The exorcist brandished a single holy sword. The bespectacled blonde used the momentum of his spin to his advantage and slashed the devil's body in a clean but shallow diagonal motion. Shing! Behind Issei, with his back to the devil's back, Naruto emerged, his right hand outstretched to the side, clutching his bloodied blade, just like the devil's left hand, which remained outstretched. The exorcist's sword's blade of light disappeared, leaving only a silver hilt, which was promptly tucked into his jacket sleeve. Issei's body erupted in blood. How? Issei exclaimed in disbelief as blood continued to flow from the wound that ran from his lower right stomach to his upper left chest. By that point, his body had lost all strength and adrenaline, and he collapsed to his knees, unable to comprehend that his defeat had been caused by a single stroke. He turned to face the devil and said, "All the power in the world means nothing if you don't know how to use it." You're still too weak and inexperienced to go up against someone like me. Issei dropped forward from his knees, his face slamming into the rough granite floor that was smeared with his own blood. The pawn knew for sure that he was not going to wake up anytime soon, even though he was still conscious. The three devils were ultimately vanquished by Naruto Uzumaki, an exorcist, and the battle was declared over. Kyoke no Ken play the day and night Shiki Ost. Naruto's icy blue eyes met the devil's ferocious glare as he gazed down at the boosted gear user's body. Was that the devil boy, Issei? He certainly possessed the capacity for strength, maybe becoming one of the most powerful creatures on the planet, a person who is powerful enough to threaten the people he looks after and the entire church he serves. He briefly had a vision of the devil standing atop a heap of the bodies of people he loved. Before he became a bigger threat, he ought to kill the devil. The fallen devil's eyes changed from a glare to one of concern as his left hand began to move toward the renowned grass-cutting sword before he even realized it. Unsheathing the sword in his back and quickly removing the brown-haired boy's head from his body would be a simple task. One memory flashed through his mind as he thought about the concept. A blue rose and a happy-looking girl in nun habit were depicted in the picture. His hand stopped inches from the handle of his divine blade as he felt a tug on his chest. The hand went to the pocket of his now crimson-stained pants rather than the renowned grass-cutter sword, saying, "You're lucky, devil, lucky that she liked you and considered you a friend." He became so engrossed in the conflict that he nearly forgot why he had initially spared them all. As he produced what appeared to be multiple stacks of holy parchment, the exorcist declared, "I overstayed my welcome, it's about time for me to go." These were Bible passages that served as the impetus for a teleportation method that his now deceased paladin of Iscariot had taught him. He placed a marker a few hours ago, and he only had to channel a tiny bit of chakra in it to teleport to a location just outside the city. But the bespectacled young man's senses went into overdrive when he smelled ozone and saw two demonic presences, alerting him to the presence of two newcomers before he could even direct his chakra onto the papers and toss them to produce their required effects. It appeared suddenly. He was about to throw the papers into the air when he suddenly created a tiny ball of blue fire, a raging conflagration, which he hurled in the direction of the ozone-rich odor. A yellow lightning bolt and his blue fireball collided for a brief moment before his attack appeared to overwhelm the bolt. It was the only issue in the direction of the two attacks. There was yet another lightning strike. This bolt was powerful enough to penetrate the blue ball of flames and the lightning bolt that had been thrown earlier. After overcoming both attacks, he charged at him with lightning speed. All he could do to escape the full force of the strike was to tilt his body slightly out of the path of the lightning bolt. Unfortunately, he was still slightly injured in the left shoulder by the bolt. He staggered back, numbness and pain radiating from the attack site, as an unbearable amount of pain tore through his body, forcing him to bite down a groan of pain. A gorgeous and svelte devil with long black hair in a familiar-looking school uniform said, Era, such a strong magic attack for a human, foo, and to have blocked my first shot and avoided my second spell like that. It looks like Mr. Exorcist here is stronger than the last one we met, bucko." She fake smiled at Naruto. Another young woman, just as attractive and seductive as the first girl, stood next to his assailant. Her eyes were different. She had more demonic and magical energy. She was more obviously angry, and finally, she had long flowing crimson blood-red hair, which signified that she was a devil from the only house that produced crimson-haired devils. These were the main differences between them. Naruto swiftly raised his hand in surrender, saying, "The Gremory girl." He did not want to be destroyed by a powerful blast of power of destruction. The red-haired girl, Rias Gremory, glared at the exorcist, ready to use her powers at any time to destroy the man who dared to attack her peerage. "Explain your actions, Hound of the Vatican," she demanded. She was well aware of the bespectacled blonde's identity because he was a popular choice among devils of the high class. After all, Naruto Uzumaki was one of the few church-affiliated humans with the ability to kill and unrestrictedly pursue high-class devils. In addition, many devils wished to murder him and forcefully reincarnate him as a member of their peerage. But if he didn't respond to her question, he won't be moving in or joining anytime soon. "If you may allow me to." He reached for his white jacket with one hand, causing a Kenneo Himejima, the other devil, to tense up and get ready to release another lightning bolt at any time. But instead of using a lightning bolt, the exorcist took out a scroll and tossed it casually in Rias' direction. Rias grabbed the scroll she was holding and gazed at it for a while she used different spells on it to see if it contained anything dangerous. She concluded after a few seconds that the scroll was comparatively innocuous and composed of ordinary papyrus. She glanced at Kenneo, and the other devil nodded, as though to warn her to keep a close eye on the exorcist. Then she opened the scroll and began to read what was inside. "I was here under the order of one of the great Seraph of Justice and Vengeance Regule, to execute one Ossia Argento for the crimes of witchcraft. healing devils. And heresy, I apologize for trespassing on your territory, princess of the Gremory clan, but I had my orders to follow. Ria's gaze moved from the parchment that, in reality, gave the blonde permission to act on the angel Ragwell's orders to the nun's lying body. She needed to be certain. Even though she could already imagine what had happened here, Rias turned to the exorcist and asked, "And why did you attack members of my peerage?" "Self-defense, you see. After terminating my target I encountered your peerage and sadly they attacked me with intent to kill. I did try to retreat several times to avoid this situation, but sadly I was forced to retaliate when your devils refused to back off." He raised his hand toward Yuto, Kaneko, and as you can see they're just injured and none of them are dead. The Gremory girl motioned to the other devil to see how the others were doing, and Naruto hesitated. He let the girl with the black hair see how their fellows were doing as she completed checking up on the final person, a still conscious Issei. The buxom black-haired devil said, "He's right, bucko. Aside from the nun the others are injured but not dead." The devil moved from one fallen body to another for approximately a minute while employing a type of diagnostic magic. Rias crossed her hands under her breasts and nodded her head with evident relief. The girl said, "I see, thanks Satan. I am willing to just let this whole business go if you're willing to do the same." For a moment, the aristocratic devil's gaze shifted to each member of her peerage. Ignoring Naruto, they were all obviously hurt, unconscious, and wounded. When her gaze finally settled on the bleeding eyes, she noticed tears welling up in the corners of his eyes. She became even more enraged with the exorcist after seeing it. "We can't have that. You injured my peerage and made my pawn sad for killing his friend." Naruto cocked his head sideways. "Really? Well, I'm sorry about that, but my mission is already accomplished. Whatever happens to her body nor her sacred gear Twilight Healing afterwards is of no concern to me. After all, as you said, I already killed her and completed my mission." The exorcist's words caused the crimson-haired princess to become alert. The secret meaning of the exorcist's words quickly became clear to her. Her gaze flicked at the sister's fallen body right away, then retreated and narrowed in on the young man with the bespectacles. "Do you mean?" Naruto swiftly interrupted the devil with his still good arm. He reached for the sword in his back and pulled it slightly in from its sheath. "I don't know what you think, but I'd prefer if we could go our separate ways, or if you want." Its slight release instantly filled the room with a sense of pure holiness that made the devils inside feel frightened and dreadful. "I didn't use this against your peerage, but if you wish to battle, then know that I will fight to the very end." Rias froze, knowing that her choice would affect everyone in the chapel. They faced a true holy sword wielder who, without even drawing the blade, vanquished her knight, rook, and pawn. The man was skilled enough to probably kill a few members of her peerage before being taken down and killed. Or worse, he kills them all without regret and starts another war between heaven and hell. She knew that she and Kenneo were strong, but she would rather not take the chance. That is not what she would want, would it? "So what is your answer, Gremory?" This was bad because, despite the number of scenarios she could think of, most of them resulted in the deaths of most of the people present. Therefore, even if it meant letting go of an adversary, she was prepared to accept any solution that could end this conflict without any casualties. Rias frowned. It was annoying that she couldn't get a good read on the blonde exorcist, who would go from being obedient to threatening to fight them. The crimson-haired ruined princess gave the exorcist a frustrated glare while keeping her arms crossed under her possessions. She inhaled deeply as she boosted her demonic energy to frighten the devil, saying, "You may leave. But if you ever point your blade to the house of Gremory, then I will not show mercy upon your soul. I will annihilate your very existence." Even Naruto did not flinch. "I will look forward to that." Issei, who was still alive, was taken aback by his king's reaction, and his eyes widened in shock. In all honesty, he thought his king would exterminate the exorcist. "You're letting him go?" "But bucko, he killed Asia," the pawn exclaimed, struggling to get upright so he could challenge his king's choice. "Eyes, we have no choice but to let him go. In all intents and purposes he was just here to fulfill his mission, while you three simply got in his way and almost got yourselves killed." As he reached for the stack of sacred texts again, this time successfully applying chakra to it before tossing it into the air where they remained floating, Naruto threatened, "Obey the words of your master devil. If you attack me again, I will retaliate with full force. If you value your life and that of your comrade lives, you shall stand down." How could you kill her?" "I killed her for her own sake." "What were you thinking? It was necessary." "What on earth are you? Who are you?" "My name is Naruto Uzumaki and I am an exorcist, an executioner of the church," the exorcist said, turning to face Issei. The bespectacled teen's blue eyes were icy cold, and a tiny, almost unsettling smile was smeared on the teen's face. Issei found the smile frightening because it seemed more sinister and insane than Fried's smile. "I follow the church's instructions. I am God's sword. The church's sword that slays pagan people and brings about divine vengeance, but above all, Devil-san is not like you." However, before departing for another location, the teenager managed to whisper out his final words for Issei Hyodo, and the other members of their small club. Naruto was abruptly surrounded by a variety of papers with strange church-like symbols and figures signifying the beginning of his spell. A holy light then surrounded the bespectacled exorcist's frame as he slowly vanished amidst the storm of papyrus. "I'm just a human being." With those final words, the group's most formidable foe to date disappeared into thin air, as if he had never been there. The only evidence of his actions was a dead nun, multiple swords, a few biblical texts, and the wounded and shattered egos of 3 devils. Kyoke no Ken. Without a doubt, the word, insane, is the best way to characterize one Fried Selzen. If you spend even a minute conversing with the young man, you'll discover that he has a lot of loose ends. In addition to being a diagnosed psychopath and sociopath, he was also a battle maniac who frequently preferred to ignore reason in favor of violence and had no qualms about killing people for his own sex. In addition, he was one of the most obscene men in the world. His words, when they were nonsensical, sometimes sounded like diarrhea, and he was willing to rape and have his ways with others on a whim, if he wasn't too busy killing women with his swords and dismembering their bodies to his satisfaction. Despite his somewhat insane and ludicrous behavior, Fried Selzen was also considered a genius by many, as he was one of the few people who were exceptionally skilled in both combat, observation, and thought. This allowed him to participate in the hunts of heathens at an early age, fighting alongside a number of prominent church figures. Because he was permitted to participate in those hunting activities, he was fully aware of his own limitations at the age of 13. He realized this when he was completely outmatched and rendered incoherent after witnessing a boy his own age kill a werewolf that he could not even harm with ease. Despite his insanity, he was still able to recall that horrifying memory of his savior dressed in blood white, brandishing a pristine silver blade that cut through the werewolf's tough hide like paper. The memory was particularly graphic, with a lot of blood splattering from the dead man's beast, and even though he didn't like blood or violence, he couldn't find it in himself to enjoy it because of a pair of icy blue eyes that looked at him as if looking through his very being. Not joy at all, but fear deep within the exiled exorcist as a result of that memory, for there was only one thing in this world that a man who had battled monsters, freed, feared, and that was Naruto Uzumaki, the so-called Sword of the Church. Therefore, he decided to flee before things worsened. After witnessing the Vatican hound snarling at his companion Screw Rainier and the others, he still wanted to kill, and it was still too early for him to die. From Fried Selzen's point of view, he was fortunate to have escaped because confronting that man was suicide. As he ran through the streets of Kuo, Fried couldn't help but feel spooked and afraid of Naruto. Even in his sadistic and insane mind, he knew that there was something terribly wrong and twisted about that blonde exorcist with the bespectacles. Naruto wasn't like the others, not even close. Fried didn't know what it was about Naruto that caused him to transcend human normalcy, and to be honest, he'd prefer not to know. He would be afraid for his own sanity if he ever did, as he was certain he lacked the mental capacity to comprehend what lay beneath the young man's exorcist facade of normalcy. His body leaned toward a street lamp as he halted his run. "You and I didn't get to kill anyone tonight," Fried grumbled, stomping his feet wildly on the ground, his breath releasing a wisp of frost from the chilly late-night temperatures. "I suppose there's always next time." Yes, without a doubt the next time. He laughed hysterically at the idea of murdering others, saying, "I'll kill a lot of people then. Too bad Naruto-senpai had to come in and kill everyone. Now I can't kill that shitty devil. What is his name? Ire? Blair? Doesn't matter," the white-haired man said, sticking his tongue out. The fact that Rainier and the other 2 fallen angels were killed before he could have his way with them was terrible, but he had to move on. That was that. Now what? Without a doubt, flee this city and avoid senpai at all costs. What should I do next? Today's near-death experience during training demonstrated to him that he was still a long way from realizing his full potential and that he still had steps to take in order to survive and come into contact with the church's sword. Where should I go? He could only go to one location. "I suppose I'll return to headquarters and meet up with Kokebile-san," he sighed in frustration, "and I hope it involves lots and lots of killing." He grinned maniacally and said, "He might give me another mission." He burst out laughing, and he skipped joyfully into the night. There was no doubt that he would be stronger the next time. Kyoke no Ken play, Omoi no Yorikata wa Kukanitsu, from the Mirai Nikki Ost. When a whirl of several sheets of sacred paper appeared just outside the city limits of Kuo, it was still late at night. A storm of sacred parchments radiated a mystic golden light, which eventually dissipated to reveal Naruto Uzumaki, the exorcist. He stood in silence for a moment, enjoying the enigmatic moonlight that fell on him and his now blood-soaked clothes. Naruto closed his eyes for a brief moment before collapsing to his knees, breathing heavily due to the immense strain on his body. For the exorcist, the night has been both physically and emotionally taxing. Physically, he had already been running around town in search of Asia before the church incident, and he had to use a number of high chakra-consuming jutsu techniques, including one that typically required 4 people. He battled 4 fallen angels, ran through the entire church while killing more stray exorcists, and then fought for a considerable amount of time against 3 devils while doing his best not to accidentally kill them so as to avoid experiencing more emotional exhaustion in the form of guilt over killing Asia's friends. The human body was limited in this way on nights like these. He cursed his humanity. If he had been an angel or something, it would have made things easier, but that was not going to be possible because heaven doesn't actually have a system for humans to reincarnate into devils like the evil peace system. At least not yet. It will be some time before such a system is even developed. The exorcist remained kneeling on the ground for a few seconds before inhaling deeply and letting the air enter his body. The brief rest and inactivity caused his chakra reserves to be somewhat restored, and he felt some of his fatigue finally subside. As he slowly rose from the ground, Naruto whispered, "Mission complete." His voice was haggard and a little worn out, and the abrupt movement served as a reminder that his own body had not emerged from the encounter unscathed. His arm was painfully numb, his skin had minor burns, and the blow he received from that bench had left his back sore. To restate what he said earlier, the human body was limited in this way. He gave the devils he battled a good beating, but he was fairly certain they wouldn't have to deal with anything like this. His arm gave him another shock of pain. Taking a few more breaths, the true holy sword user allowed his mind to wander, wondering if Asia experienced a similar type of pain when he killed her, or if it could have been as painless as he had intended. The pain was a little annoying, but he really did not care much about it because he was already accustomed to it from his early training to develop a high tolerance for pain. She would be safe and content in the midst of those devils, he hoped, just as he hoped his little gambit would have paid off, and she would be protected by the Gremory clan, a clan closely related to the current Lucifer, which he was certain the church would be reluctant to attack for fear of starting another war between heaven and hell. She would be dead if it didn't, which was another likely scenario that he'd rather not consider because he was a bit of an optimist. Actually, he was more of a realist. But occasionally being an optimist didn't hurt because, in the end, there wasn't anything else to do but be optimistic and hope for the best. Even though it would mean that she would not only be his enemy but also that she would have to avoid him, she was now in a place where she would be accepted and not stigmatized by the title of Fallen Maiden. She would be happy with the devils and find a home among the enemy of humanity, of which she was now a part, a home that he was not. If she were to find a new life, she would be happy with them. Naruto let out a sigh and then looked up at the stars and moon in the night sky. He felt compelled to do something to express his sorrow over his role in a friend's death, but he quickly dismissed such thoughts with a shake of his head, saying that it was not the right time and that it could wait until later. Time to go back and report to headquarters, Naruto said as he began to leave the city, choosing to walk along the comparatively deserted nightly road, with the moon as the only source of light. The teenager said in a rather dejected tone, "I hope you live a happy life, Asia," as he continued to walk towards the night's darkness without even casting a final glance in the direction of the city. As long as his friends and those he cared about were happy, he was happy too. He couldn't be sad because his sadness would make others sad, and he didn't want that because he lived to make people happy. He was happy despite the pain in his chest and the regret that echoed in his head. His faint, hardly perceptible footsteps were carried away by the wind before his body vanished into the night goddess embrace, bearing only the perverted beliefs of a blood-stained idiot. Kyoke no Ken. During that same night, 2 figures, one taller than the other, stood a few miles away from the fleeing exorcist. The darkness of the night obscured most of their features, leaving only the color of their eyes and a crude outline of their bodies, which, based on their shape, indicated that the 2 were most likely men. The Vatican hound vanished, followed by the red eyes of the smaller figure. "What do you think of him? I would advise our group to do this." The big shadow nodded his head, and there was a little movement. "Very effective, very skilled, and very lethal. An ideal complement to his already remarkable heritage. He will perform well in our organization. However, I find myself wondering why he took the extra effort to spare those devils." The smaller one responded, remembering his previous encounters with the sword and the maiden. Perhaps it was because of the wish of the fallen maiden. After all, the 2 of them knew each other from way back. "I see. Did you and him also have a relationship like that? I mean, friends like he had with the nun?" In denial, the smaller shadow shook his head. "No more about the competitors. He was the church's second-best swordsman when we were younger, followed by me in 3rd place and the Longinus user in 1st. Just as I was a worthy opponent with my true holy sword, he was a worthy opponent with my demonic blades." "You said to not have seen him for a few years." "Indeed, I haven't seen or heard of him since I left the church a few years back." Did he then get better or worse with the blade based on the fight we saw? With his gaze still lingering on the church where the one-sided battle took place, the taller figure inquired. The smaller shadow hesitated for a few seconds before responding, saying, "Unquestionably better, his swordsmanship and skill surpasses mine, as much as I hate to admit it. While he is not as good as Georg in magic or Heracles in strength, he is comparable to Arthur in pure swordsmanship and Jean in speed, but when it comes to watching and analyzing his opponents, he is on par with you and also quite calculating. That's how he's been since we were young. He has a lot of potential, and his skills will help us eradicate all the evils that endanger humanity from this planet. I would like to invite him right away, but I have a gut feeling that we should hold off. Take it as a hunch." "You're never the type to rely on hunches." The larger shadow closed his eyes as he instructed his companion, saying, "Just this once I feel like following it. Alert the others, tell them to watch the movements of one Naruto Uzumaki. Don't interact with him, just watch. Whether it's time for us to extend an invitation will be up to me to decide." Before disappearing into the night, the smaller shadow said, "Consider it done." With his eyes still on the path the exorcist had taken, the taller of the two shadows simply grinned in return. The descendant of the second sage Naruto Uzumaki. Before disappearing into the night, the man said, "In one way or another, you will join our cause, and together we will rid this world of monsters." Kyokia no Ken play Lost My Pieces, extended, from Toradora, Ost. After the entire incident in Kuo, a few days later, Naruto Uzumaki was back on the streets of the Vatican in the evening, walking down a random street and politely nodding to people he saw or shaking his head at those who offered him an umbrella because the pitter and patter of the evening rain had soaked his body. With no real destination in mind, the exorcist found himself walking down the road, thinking about that day. In actuality, he got there earlier that day. When he arrived in the Vatican that early in the afternoon, it was a little overcast like everyone else in this day and age. He boarded an airplane and was seated next to a crying infant, depriving him of sleep that he hadn't had since the day he killed Asia. He took a taxi to the church that housed the headquarters of his organization after the lengthy flight, and he went through the same wooden doors, down the same stairs, greeted the same people, went down the same secret passageway, presented his identification to the guards, and entered the same room where one of his former mentors and current boss was sitting. He gave a detailed report of his activities upon his arrival in Kuo. As he always did after every mission, he detailed his encounter with the temporary representative, his stalking of Asia and Issei, his attack on the abandoned church, where he killed everything, including his target Ossia Argento, his battle with the devils, their defeat at his hands, his encounter with the Gramarye girl, and his retreat. He was careful not to bring up the gamble he had taken for Asia's sake, but he could see it in the sparkle in his handler Garul's eyes, as though he was aware of what had happened but lacked concrete evidence to expose him. Naruto was given a week's vacation for his actions and his string of successful missions, though he wasn't sure if that was a form of punishment or not. The man said that even the strongest blades need to be cleaned, repaired, and sheathed occasionally to prevent dulling or breaking, and he threw him out of the office after 7 days, telling him not to return. It was already early in the evening when the bespectacled blonde left the church and began his walk. The clouds were in charge of the sky and were roaring and rumbling, alerting him to the impending rain. Not that he was distracted by the rain. No, he didn't mind it at all. Rather than worrying about getting wet, the exorcist found himself walking aimlessly, worrying more about being given a day off. While many people would enjoy a day off, Naruto Uzumaki didn't share this sentiment. He detested it because, first, it prevented him from training his body or fighting, and, second, it allowed his mind to wander and reflect on all of his actions. His thoughts were focused on a single person at this precise moment as he was walking through the streets and the first drops of rain began to fall on his body. Argento Asia memories flashed through his head, bringing back memories of their childhood. The moments when she sobbed and he did his best to console her. She did her best to teach him about his own feelings during those moments. When she was being bullied by other children, he defended her. The moments they spent in the garden admiring the blue roses. When he was hurt, she would heal him. The evenings when he read her stories. When they were children, they used to play. The moments she gave him a smile. Every time he thought of the fair maiden, he felt a pain in his chest, which he knew was entirely his own fault. He claimed to have no regrets, but he knew that he was secretly feeling a little sad about what he had done. Many people would be happy now that she was dead. In fact, he could hear them discussing throwing a party in her honor. But why did he feel so incredibly depressed? Shouldn't he be relieved that others were happy? Shouldn't that be enough to ease his own suffering? Cerulean blue eyes blinked repeatedly as he suddenly realized he was drenched in rain. But then a particularly loud booming sound from the heavens jolted the young man out of his reverie and brought him back to the present. "Oh, it's raining tonight," he said absent-mindedly, Letting his gaze wander to see where his spontaneous journey had taken him, to his astonishment, he discovered that he was in a familiar location. He was standing in front of a particular church's garden. When he was younger, he was particularly drawn to the blue roses in that same garden. "What brought me here? It's raining so hard," he said, looking up at the sky, the dark, rainy heavens welcoming him with their cold droplets, accompanied by the fond memories of the time he spent with the young maiden in this very garden as he felt larger raindrops fall on his body. Then, his head moved from the sky to the ground, and his sorrowful blue eyes fell on the blue roses that were lying in the garden of the church. The stunning blue roses, rustling and trembling a little as the rain soaked them. The same roses that made him think of her. "I'm sorry, Asia." Almost instinctively, he spoke those words. It was the same thing he wanted to tell her all those days ago, but was unable to do so because of that brown-haired devil's abrupt interruption. Those words were accompanied by 2 streams of tears streaming from his eyes, which had been begging to escape ever since the day he killed her by hand. Being depressed wasn't good in his opinion, but for this one moment, under the icy rain, with only the roses as his witnesses, he let the tears fall. The young man wept for the first time in his life. As if giving him some measure of privacy, his gentle sobs were muffled by the pitter-patter of the rain, so that only he and the roses could see and hear his sorrow. Tears were streaming down Naruto's eyes as he stood there for the remainder of that night, watching the blue roses beneath the rain. He remained there for many hours until the tears ceased. He remained there for many hours until the rain stopped. He remained there for hours on end until the pain in his heart subsided. When Naruto Uzumaki left the blue rose garden, it was already early in the morning. Under the meager remnants of the merciless and freezing rain, he strolled alone through the streets, his hands gripping a single object that he held almost protectively, one blue rose.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.